Good afternoon and welcome to this afternoon's session of the Education Committee. I would advise members that the committee meeting will be recorded and broadcast throughout Parliament buildings and online, and I would advise anyone in the public gallery that they're welcome to use mobile devices as long as they are in airplane mode and that all devices are muted. You can connect to the Assembly Wi-Fi, and the password details for that are available in the gallery rules. I would just remind that it's not permitted to take photographs or record any of the meeting. That's great. Okay, so that takes us to item 1, which is apologies. No apologies, but we do have a few members joining remotely. So we have Cara, Colin, Danny and Kathy all joining us online. Oh, I can see Colin, you've indicated there.
Oh. Chair, can I just apologise? I need to log off around 4 o'clock, so I'll just apologise for that now.
No problem. Thank you for that, Colin. That's noted. And look, as usual, if there are any issues with audio or your indications being seen, just to let the clerk know. What I will do, because we have a number of people joining online, if I would ask if you could indicate using the raise hand function rather than going through the clerk from that, just so it's we're making sure we're bringing people in the right order. Item 2 then is chairperson's business. So look, first of all, I'd just like to thank the deputy chair for covering last week's informal and formal committee sessions. I was off ill, and that's appreciated. The other items of chairperson's business then is item 2.1, and that's an informal briefing that was held with the charity Angel Eyes last week. I should just note my interest in that, as my wife is an employee of that charity. But I would refer members to the record of the informal briefing and the briefing papers from Angel Eyes, which provided an overview of their work, and that's at page 5 of members' packs. So obviously I wasn't at that. Can I just check in with members if there are any actions arising on that or anything to be raised?
I thought it was really interesting. Very impressed with them. I don't know if there's any kind of follow-up around the training that they provide. If we can find out more from the department, if they're taking an interest in that or how that might be applied.
I'm certainly happy to suggest we can write to ask if there is an interest in taking up the engagement with the Angel Eyes training, if members are agreed.
Yeah.
Agreed. Okay. No, that's great. I'll leave that one there then. Item 2.2 is Construction Futures Open Doors Initiative. So I would just refer members to an invite from Construction Futures at page 12 of your packs. So I'm unable to attend any of those timings, unfortunately, as I was invited in my role as chair, but they're very open to other members who may be interested in attending. So I would just ask members to note that for their diaries and to contact the organisers directly. And then item 2.3 of chairperson's business is just a note that myself and the deputy chair had a pre-briefing with Department of Education official on the transformed NI strategy, the transforming teaching and learning strategy for educational excellence in Northern Ireland, and that strategy is at page 4 of your table papers. I don't propose any action at this stage. No doubt we will hear from the department on that at some point, but I think members were all in the chamber for the minister's statement and were able to ask questions there. So unless anyone has anything else to raise. No. Okay, that takes us to item 3, and that's declarations of interest. Are there any declarations of interest in relation to today's briefings? No. If anything arises, as usual, please do indicate. So that takes us to item 4, and that's matters arising. So there are a number of things to cover here, specifically in relating to the school uniforms guidelines and allowances bill. We had a briefing from the Department of Education on the bill and from the Bill Clark last week at committee. And we are now just taking forward some of the actions around progressing the committee stage of the bill. So the first item I would draw members' attention to is a draft timeline for the bill at page 8 of table papers. Are members content with that proposed timeline for the committee stage of the bill? Hopefully members have all had an opportunity to have a look at that, and perhaps if I maybe ask the clerk to speak to that first, just to give us an overview of the timelines, and then we can just seek agreement on that.
Yes, certainly, Chair. So as advised last week, a committee stage is a minimum of 30 days, and on balance, most committees extend to round about a year. So this timeline factors in all of the requisite parts of the committee stage, so the call for evidence, the consideration of evidence, the oral evidence giving, deliberation and consideration of amendments, drafting of a report, clause by clause, like your final decision-making stage, and then agreement of the report and publication, after which the committee hands back over to plenary for the amending stages. So those are the timeframes that are built in that you can see in front of you. Obviously there are a couple of recesses there which unfortunately are outside of our control, and we've actually added a couple of weeks at the end for flexibility, but this is not we're aiming to get it done within that time. We don't have to prolong the process until the 3rd of December by any means. So
yeah, I mean, I would certainly want to emphasise, I don't want anyone to consider the 3rd of December there as a target that we want to hit in terms of finishing. I think we would be keen to complete the committee stage before that if possible, but that's just to build in any flexibility. My concern, I think, that there was an interest from the department in getting this delivered before the summer recess. My concern with that is really that if we were to try to operate to that timescale, really once our call for evidence is complete and we've heard evidence from stakeholders, it would give the committee really no time beyond that to look at the bill in any more detail, which I don't think would represent good scrutiny. Realistically, for all the stages that have to complete in the Assembly beyond that, it's not going to be ready from September 2025 regardless, so I don't think unnecessary haste is required. I think it's important that we do look at the detail on this. So I'm certainly happy to endorse that timescale. I'm happy to open it up to the Deputy Chair first and then to any other members.
I'm content with that also.
Okay. Any other views, Peter?
Chair, thank you very much. Yep. Look, I think the Minister did signpost the fact that he wanted this in place as quickly as possible, and there's really good reasons for that in terms of what we have discussed both at committee and in the chamber. I think there's a balance there in terms of our job is to scrutinise, and I think the date of November was mentioned in terms of getting all this through in order for this to be in place for the next school year. And in fact, as boards of governors put together obviously the requirements for new intake, I don't see how that's going to be necessarily achievable, and look, ultimately I suppose we would like to shave a wee bit off this, but ultimately given the fact it will have further consideration in the Assembly to go through anyway, I think, and losing the summer in terms of recess, it kind of is what it is.
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you, Peter. David, had you indicated that?
Thanks, Chair. I largely agree with Peter. The one aspect I probably want to focus on, and without expertise on it, and I don't have it on the top of my head in that regard, is lead-in times for our independent retailers who at the moment will supply uniforms, but who will be very much watching to see what comes out of this and how it will affect their business. I think that's one element we probably need to try and get information on and see how that affects how we look at this timeline in terms of, I understand you're saying it's not a target, but ultimately I think whatever happens with this legislation, it's important that there's flexibility to allow firms a sort of fair transition to it in that regard, and so take mind of when some of this stuff will kick in and how it will affect them and how our timeline will affect that. I think is worth keeping in mind.
Well, I think that is an important point. I mean, certainly you would expect that stakeholders in the retail space we would be wanting to engage with them, and again, I think by cutting the time short, we would reduce our opportunity to do that. So, but no, I think we will hear from retailers on that. It's clear to me there's no mechanism by which this can be ready for the incoming academic year. But I do take your point around retailers and needing to do that engagement. I don't think I'm sensing any dissent, and I have no other indications. So are members content with the proposed timeline for the committee stage of the bill, with that caveat that we're certainly not aiming to drag it to the 3rd of December if that can be avoided? Yep. Okay. Great. Okay. So then I would refer members to a draft signposting advertisement, and that's at page 10 of tabled papers, and also a draft call for evidence on the bill at page 11 of tabled papers, and a draft list of stakeholders to be consulted directly on the bill at page 12 of tabled papers. Are members content with the signposting advertisement, the call for evidence, and the list of stakeholders that's been proposed? Are we agreed?
Agreed.
Okay, agreed. And just to check, I don't recall off the top of my head if Retail NI were on there, but I think Retail NI would be one that we would want to make sure are added if they haven't been already, because they wouldn't necessarily be on our regular list of stakeholders.
We can add to this list,
Yeah.
can't we? Yeah.
Yeah, please
As long
email
as it's
me
not
anyone that you
exhaustive
want to add. And Retail NI, we've already done pre-legislative engagement
Yeah.
with them, so yes, we'll certainly
Make sure we
move them in.
we circulate this one. That's great. So
you.
we're agreed then.
Yep.
Okay, and then I'd refer members to a draft motion. That's at page 15 of tabled papers, which is the motion to extend the committee stage of the bill to Wednesday, the 3rd of December 2025. Are members content with that motion? Is that agreed?
Agreed.
Great. Okay, that's great. So that takes us to item 5, which is the draft minutes. So I would refer members to the draft minutes of the committee meeting of the 5th of March 2025, and that's at page 18. Are members agreed that those are a complete and accurate record of proceedings?
Agreed.
Agreed. Is that for me to sign there then? Yep. Okay, thank you. Okay, so that takes us to the next item on our agenda, which is item 6, and it is the first of a series of briefings this afternoon in relation to integrated education, and it is a joint oral briefing from the Integrated Education Fund and NICE. So just while the witnesses are being brought through, I would refer members to the briefing note from the committee clerk at page 27, an infographic on integrated education, which is at page 28, and a presentation from Seaview Integrated Primary School around their transformation journey, which is at page 14 of tabled papers. So I'll just let everybody get seated at this stage, and then we'll move on to the main briefing. Can I just check through yourself, Clark? Is it worth raising the issues around the legal proceedings at this stage?
Yeah, we can speak to that.
So I'll maybe ask the clerk just to speak to the issues around. There has been members will be aware, a legal challenge brought in relation to the Minister's decision around the 2 schools in Bangor, which had applied for integrated status and was declined by the Minister, and a legal challenge has been introduced. So I'll just ask the clerk just to speak to that, as we took a little bit of advice around what aspects of that we're able to discuss today.
So the sub judice rule that applies to the Assembly is intended to protect the distinct constitutional roles of the legislature as distinct from the court. And generally, when a matter is sub judice, which is to say under consideration by a court already, it shouldn't be referred to in committee proceedings. And Standing Order 73 contains the sub judice rule. In this instance, I believe the legal action is at the very early stage of just exchange of letters and pre-action protocols. So the sub judice rule does not come into force until an action is listed in court, and it may not even come to that. So we're outside of it just now.
So effectively, we're free to raise questions on those issues then, and if that's helpful for the witnesses as well in terms of that, and obviously it'll be up to individual witnesses to decide what they're content to discuss if those issues do arise. So I'll just begin by doing the initial welcome to everybody who is here today, and then you can do your own intros. If I get any job titles wrong, it has been known. So with us today we have Sean Pettis, the Chief Executive Officer for the NI Council for Integrated Education, NICE. We have Paul Caskey, the Chief Executive Officer for the Integrated Education Fund, and we also have Barry Core, the Principal of Seaview Integrated Primary School. So you're all very welcome here today. Now I appreciate there may be 3 potentially separate presentations or sets of opening remarks. So we'll give a little bit longer. I would suggest around 15 minutes. Prepared to push that a little bit if you are all doing a full presentation, and then we'll move into question and answer. And I would just ask members to be mindful of time in relation to this, and we'll look to keep each inquiry to 5 minutes per member, just given we do have a bigger panel and a number of different evidence sessions today. So at that stage I'm going to hand over. I'm not sure who's kicking off, but we'll over to Paul.
Chair.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Chair and members. So, good afternoon, and thank you very much for the opportunity to present to the committee today. Paul Caskey, Chief Executive of the Integrated Education Fund. So we're important to state we're a registered charity. We were set up in 1992 with the support of the Department of Education and other bodies to support the growth and development of integrated education here in Northern Ireland. Our mandate is derived from the express demand from parents and schools for their children to have integrated education. As an independent charity, we're entirely dependent on donors and supporters, and we're delighted to have provided in excess of around £30 million worth in grant aid to support the development of schools supporting integrated education. About 8 years ago, our organisation embarked on a campaign to empower parents in schools who were interested in integrated education. Since then, we have experienced unprecedented growth, particularly in the last 5 or 6 years, following 28 positive parental ballots held by schools considering transformation. To date, this has resulted in the creation of a further 12 approved integrated schools, with a number of schools currently in the process. We believe this presents clear behavioural evidence of growing demand for integrated education from parents and schools, and this includes the first ever integrated nursery to be established and the first former Catholic school to transform the integrated status. The 76 integrated schools we have today is a result of action by parents. Parents either established new schools in their community, or parents have voted in favour of their child's school becoming integrated. This route, the second route, transformation, has become the predominant pathway to integrated status in recent years, partly as a result of the overall demographic decline in pupil numbers and the over-provision of schools generally in Northern Ireland, and is arguably the most cost-effective way to expand integrated education. Equally important to note that none of the 76 schools that have opened is as a result of government planning. However, we are encouraged by the approval of Causeway Academy, a new controlled integrated post-primary school serving the North Coast and incorporating North Coast Integrated College, along with Coleraine College and Dunluce School, and that's a result of area plan and agreement between the schools. It is the IEF's hope that going forward, integrated education can be properly and adequately planned for by government and demand from parents can be met. Therefore, the full implementation of the Integrated Education Act of 2022 is of critical importance. The legislation sets out the meaning of this additional requirement of support, and that is identifying, assessing, monitoring and aiming to meet the demand for the provision of integrated education within the context of area planning and sustainability of the school's estate, and by providing sufficient places to meet that demand. Progress, the IEF believes, has been very slow, and in almost 3 years since the bill was passed, we are still awaiting a satisfactory definition of demand that includes all available evidence. And we believe this should include the democratic wishes of parents expressed through the ballots in schools that are overseen by the department. We are concerned around the general lack of clarity around benchmarks and targets in the current Section 10 strategy, and we are concerned about the lack of funding and resource committed to implementing the strategy. Moreover, the Section 10 report laid before the Assembly in April 2024 highlights unmet demand at post-primary level in 6 council areas, one of which is Ards and North Down. The strategy refers to a call for transformation in these localities. Therefore, I hope the committee understand why we find it difficult to understand how the department's very own strategy can sit with the recent decision to deny integrated status to Bangor Academy in sixth form, a post-primary school in an area of unmet demand and a school whose parents overwhelmingly backed such a move. And I want to finish on this point, which is another area of interest, great interest to the IEF, is a recommendation of the Independent Review of Education of a proposed reconfiguration of the network of schools to create 177 new or reconfigured jointly managed community schools. It would appear to us that little has been said or done since the report of the Independent Review team in this area. We have funded a series of work in partnership with Ulster University and indeed other sectoral support bodies in providing extensive research designed at encouraging and supporting sustainable school solutions for communities without any predetermined outcome. This has ranged from carrying out community conversations, providing toolkits to support both primary and post-primary solutions, identifying evidence of isolated pairs of schools who could become sustainable if innovative solutions could be agreed. This work is designed to support more community input into the planning process for schools, and I hope that will be of interest to the committee. To finish, the IEF simply want the demand for integrated education to be fairly measured and with corresponding action to aim to meet such demand, and we want to empower parents, local communities and schools to have their say on the future of education provision on a more sustainable basis. Thank you very much. I'll hand over to Sean.
Thank you. So good afternoon, everyone. Thanks again for the opportunity to speak with you today. I think most of you will be familiar, but by way of background, NICE was formed in 1987 as a charitable body to coordinate efforts to develop integrated education. Following the passing of the 89 Education Order, we've been funded by the Department of Education to support their statutory duties. Since then, we've also been designated as a non-departmental public body. So our mission is to promote reconciliation through integrated education, and our vision is a society where children are educated together, confident to express their own identity and culture, and respectful of and prepared to engage with the identity and culture of others. Our strategic objectives are to support, promote and grow integrated education, and our main aim is to enable every family and child that want an integrated education to be able to access it. So as Paul mentioned, we have about 28,500 children and young people enrolled in 73 schools, which is a great feat, and further growth is possible. Over the last number of years, that growth's been dramatic, and it's put a further demand on our services, not just in terms of supporting transforming schools, but in supporting existing schools to explore and develop their ethos. And there's been a number of positive developments over recent times in terms of ethos support. For example, just 2 weeks ago we launched the Framework for Integrated Education, which is a joint initiative between the Education Authority and NICE, and that resource supports transforming schools to self-assess where they're at in terms of integration and to kind of form a pathway through the integrated process. It complements the NICE Excellence in Integrated Education Award, which is also a self-evaluation tool. And that award enables established schools to kind of self-quality assure their provision, but also have that independently verified. And we're delighted there's over 40 schools now that have either achieved the award or working towards it or renewing that. And the focus on ethos is really important because it's where we see one of the most distinctive features of integrated education. Integrated schools are intentional about enrolling a diverse student population, and they're equally intentional about what they do with that mix in the life of the school, including, of course, at Board of Governor level. Integrated schools strive to achieve this balance in a really planned way, and this can be done in a number of ways through building relationships in the wider community which encourage applications from families from different and diverse traditions, be that religion, belief, worldview. It can be through the ongoing engagement in staff development of policies and practices in the school that embed an anti-bias approach in everything they do. And of course through making sure that you're enabling different cultural and religious celebrations to be marked and explored in the life of the school. But of course the ultimate test of integrated education really is the experiences of the children and young people that go through it. And so I'm pleased that you're engaging with the integrated alumni later in the session. But I think this intentionality of mixing is really important because when we look at mixing across the two traditions in Northern Ireland, it's still rare. Looking at 22-23 statistics, there's approximately 1,000 primary and post-primary schools in Northern Ireland. Only 153 schools have at least a 10% mix from both traditions. And when you take out the integrated schools from that, you're talking about 85 schools. So mixing is still not commonplace. We are also awaiting the publication of the Integrated Education Strategy, and we're excited about the role NICE can play in further promoting, supporting and growing integrated education to meet demand. And we hope that the plan will be suitably resourced so we can realise our ambition that every family and child that wants an integrated education can access it. So thank you.
Okay, so it's over to me, so I'm just going to start off with a selfie. So I probably mightn't be invited back here, so And I've started off my presentation with the word smile. Everybody needs to smile. It's that part of the afternoon where you start to sort of weigh in a wee bit. You know, my next couple of slides there said, you know how to take a good one. And obviously you have to hold the phone up here, and that's very important. But if you look a wee bit closer and go behind, look a wee bit deeper, you will see that you know, the both of those selfies were taken from the Falls Road, and they were taken from the Shankill Road. And we have to remember that we're coming from a post-conflict society, and we're emerging to break down sectarian divisions. We aim to bring together children from different religions and cultural backgrounds to sort of to learn together and to grow in a shared environment. Now, if we go on to the yellow buses, they have been instrumental in sort of part of my life. The first one is the old EA bus, and I'm from Stewartstown, outside Stewartstown in Tyrone, and I used to get that to school every day, and I was sick with the diesel. The second one is, I believe it or not, was at Woodstock 2 in 1994, and that was 25 years after Woodstock 1. And I thought it was quite, it was a wee bit of a shocker that our campsite was 50 miles from the gig, and we had to get a yellow bus. But the most important is the yellow bus at the bottom. Whenever I was appointed principal in Seaview Primary School, as it was in Glenarm, I looked out through my window and I could see 2 yellow buses leaving every day from the village, and they were leaving to go to other, to different schools, not their village school. So I knew there was something wrong. And around that time, or shortly after it, we had a community conversation. It was organised by the University of Ulster, and there were, at that time, there were 3 schools in the area, and they came together and come up with, you know, and we asked parents and the locality what they thought, and they all come up with a plan that there should be a Catholic school or a maintained school in Carnlough, and there should be an integrated school in Glenarm, and more or less that is what has happened. So in 2019 was a very big year for us, but remember that 2018-19 our enrolment was 42. We had a lot of support from the IEF. We went on to the Integrate My School website. We had a lot of board governor support. We had pop-in days for the local community to tell them about our plan to become integrated. And it was important that we shared that. We did some dramatic things. We tried to live like an integrated school. We changed the prayers. With the children made up a morning prayer and an afternoon prayer. And we also, I remember someone says to me, what are you going to do with blessing yourselves? Because you're a Catholic school, how do you start your prayers? So we start our prayers by saying, for example, on assembly, on a Friday, I would say, get ready for prayer the way your mummy or daddy taught you. And some people will bless themselves, and some people will hold their hands like this. And I also say, if you do not say prayers at home, I want you to think of a happier time in your life. So what happened, that, as I said, that was a massive year for us, and the parents got to vote. We had enough people to go to a vote, and 95% of our parents said yes. So you can see there that we went to the beach in Glenarm and we made the word yes with the pebbles of the beach. So what happened then after that was quite dramatic with our enrolment. Our enrolment, as I said, was 42. We were putting the word out that we wanted to become integrated, and people were buying into it. So our numbers went up to 67 the following year, then 80, 87, 97, 108. You can see how that was growing. So in May 2019 or June 2019, our enrolment was 42. In that September, it was 67. So that was quite a leap. And then we had, we had the slide. If you can just go back a wee slide there, yes. So basically, CCMS were saying, well, hold on a minute, your enrolment is 42. We're going to close you. And we sort of said, well, you know what, you can't fire us because we quit. We've decided to move on. We want to become integrated. We were very hopeful that that would be the case. So we put in our own development proposal to the Department of Education through the EA. And lo and behold, it was approved in 2021. And as you can see, the year after that, our numbers went up to 80 and then to 87. And then that's when the hard work started. We had to have a new logo, a new uniform. We set up a governor-teacher group. Luckily, the IEF gave us some money to help towards new signage, etc. And then we had the big opening. The big opening was the 1st of September. Big, massive opening. You can see the late Baroness May Blood there. She helped us to cut the tape. Unfortunately, I was just back from visiting cousins in England, and I got COVID and I couldn't make it. So I was doing all these radio interviews and pretending I was at the school. And then, as I said, the parents were very instrumental, because there was a time after that where we are still embedding our integrated ethos. The parents, governors and staff and pupils, we come up with our vision and our values. And that is ongoing. And so people will say, well, that's really good, but what's the difference? What's changed? So as I said before, it is a school for everyone in the local village, in the local area. Everyone can be educated together. We do all different types of sports. Our prayers are different. There's our religion is different. We have sacramental expectation from parents, and it's part of our culture. It's part of our school development plan. This year's Integration Month. We have an integrated coordinator, and we have a very healthy balance of pupils and staff and governors. So that is a very quick overview of what happened in probably a 5-year, 6-year period. So I think we're going to go to questions, if that's right.
Brilliant. Thank you to all three of the witnesses for the presentation, and it's really helpful to hear directly from a school to understand what that journey towards transformation looked like, and I'm sure there'll be questions from members around that in a bit more detail as we go through the session. I just wanted to track right back to the beginning of Paul's presentation, and you referenced quite clearly the monitoring and aiming to meet demand for integrated education that is in the Integrated Education Act. Can you just give a little bit more detail about how you would assess how the department has progressed that aspect of the Integrated Education Act, so that monitoring and aiming to meet demand? So what's the progress been like on that?
I'll start by saying actually the department have used research that we funded through ARC, through the two major universities here, which was my understanding through the Section 10 report, that's been divided into societal data and then behavioural data. Societal data, which we'll be familiar with, would be those wider general surveys. Sometimes they're commissioned by ourselves, sometimes they're commissioned by organisations like the Life and Time Survey. Unfortunately, I've been at this too long. I think over the last 25 years, it's nearly always between the band of probably the lowest 55, 60 and the highest 75, 80% when the surveys take place. So, and people are suspicious of society data because they'll say to us, that's very aspirational, that's, that's sort of cloud cuckoo land stuff. It's not really what people do. So the second strand to measuring demand is really important, is looking at behavioural data. Our problem with the assessment of how we understand behavioural data is going to be looked at the moment is just by looking at what we got now, which is static, and looking at the applications that come through to integrated schools. Now, not all, by all means, not all, but there are a number of integrated schools that are heavily oversubscribed, and therefore the department has identified those areas. I said that with some irony in terms of the Bangor decision, but that was one of the council areas. But we feel strongly that when parents have been given the opportunity through the democratic process, through a transformation ballot, that those results speak loudly. I mean, if I was talking about 1 or 2 schools in 5 years, people might say, well, maybe that's not that significant. But when you look at 28 over 5 years, and you look at it at a primary level, post-primary level, nursery level, spread throughout the country, and you look at that, and the overwhelming majority, as you know, of those cases have, and probably higher in most cases than some of the societal data, we feel that's very, very important. and that the department should acknowledge that as evidence of demand. We are aware, and I'm sure the department officials might expand on that, because I don't know whether that's out in the public domain, of different initiatives that the department will be planning to undertake, whether that's further societal evidence through life and time surveys, but also working with the EA as well. But it's taken a long time. To get a satisfactory definition that we think that hasn't been provided yet. That's the starting point. And if we can't get to the starting point, how can we ever get the aim to meet demand if we can't get a satisfactory definition or an adequate way of measuring it? I'm not sitting here saying easy and say we've invested our donors' money to help the department to look at this. So that's how willing we are to contribute to that issue, Chair.
I think, was it 3 years on from the Act? I mean, has enough progress been made effectively? I mean, I'm hearing that you don't feel it has. So what would you like to see the department do to rectify that?
Part of the challenge here is the draft strategy isn't yet published, so it's hard to give you a definitive answer until we see the draft that's going to be consulted upon. Certainly, we recognise it is extremely complex. It's hard to do, and we're up for working with the department to look at how best to do this. But similarly to Paul, it's for us isn't just about oversubscription in existing schools. It has to be about moving beyond that, including parental ballots and use of wider surveys and engagement tools like Future Schools and community conversations and those type of things.
There's also, I think, another point, Chair, is if we look at it too statically, there are going to be areas and communities in Northern Ireland that simply just don't have a choice, particularly at primary level, where parents aren't, they tend not to travel. To travel more distances of post-primary, but if you don't have a choice in your area, that information's unlikely to come forward on the admissions portal. If you don't have a realistic option, then that won't be reflected as well. So I think we need a broader, more accurate, defined way of doing it, and we're prepared to work with anybody to achieve that.
Okay, just to sort of probably to stick with demand. I mean, I was struck by the department's Section 10 report that set out Ard's North Down Borough Council, particularly as an area of unmet demand for integrated education at post-primary level, going as far, and you referenced this, as to putting out a call for transformation for the schools there. But we then have a school that was already in the system proposing to become integrated, and that the Minister then refused that. How do you respond to that in terms of how that leaves schools who are thinking about transformation at the moment, if they're being told on the one hand by the department, we'd like you to come forward because we see there's demand that is not being met, and then on the other hand a minister who ignores that duty, as far as I can tell, to meet demand and says no? Where does that leave schools who are considering transformation?
Well, I think it leaves them in a difficult position. I think if anybody who's followed the situation with the two Bangor schools will acknowledge the huge amount of work. We're talking over a 3 or 4 year period of investment. It's not a matter of just simply having a vote and then someone deciding whether you become integrated. There's a whole transformation action plan that they work forward. So there's a lot of work involved. I can totally understand why any principal today who was looking at this would go, should I embark on this process for 2 or 3 years down the line to be told no? In fact, to be told what they should be told is you're not going to get it anyway. I wouldn't bother, because if that's the way the decision appeared, was because of the minister's interpretation, really, of reasonable numbers and census data in that area. So I do know that from the two schools, that they felt they put all this amount of work in. So, but we're not going to be deterred in the sense of we will build the confidence. We will work with any parents in schools. Obviously, we have had schools approved in that process as well, which the Minister would remind us of in terms of the 3 nursery schools. So we're determined to push forward and support those parents in schools coming forward, but it does make it a more difficult environment.
Hard sort of process to try and reconcile those two things, to be calling for transformation on one hand and refusing it on the other. Just one really quick question, probably for Nicey, if that's okay. In terms of sort of duties arising from the Act and in terms of implementation of it, have you received additional resource to carry out any of the additional functions that Nicey are required to do to actually deliver that, and is it sufficient?
Not at this point, no. So we don't have a budget allocation for the 25-26 financial year yet, And again, while we have indication of the types of activities we might be engaged in, we don't have that finalised yet in terms of the strategy being approved. So it's difficult to forecast that as well. But we've been clear that in order to fully deliver the ambition of the plan, it will require additional resources.
Chair, if I could maybe just follow up on that, Sean, just to illustrate one point. One of the requirements around the Section 10 Act is we're looking at the excellence in integrated education. That's something, again, that the IEF, as a charitable organisation, has been providing additional funding to NICE and to the schools to make that happen. So all I would say is that if the department is expecting NICE to undertake even more work in an area of increased demand at this time, that the IEF's view that NICE need to be adequately resourced to make that happen.
We can certainly pick that up with the department. Okay, that's all from me at the moment. I'll bring the Deputy Chair in, and then if other members want to indicate.
And thanks for coming in. I'm a supporter of integrated education. My big criticism of it is, and you've probably heard me saying this before, is that it isn't integrated enough, and that the focus is too much on religion rather than other fault lines within society and within our education system. And from my perspective, the major fault line within our education system is the segregation of children on the basis of their socioeconomic background. And I think that emphasis on religion has allowed the Minister to make the decision he did make around the 2 schools in Bangor. So in my view, as someone who worked with Kelly Armstrong and her team to help develop the integrated education bill, I would suggest now that that's a weakness within the bill. What would your views on that be?
I think one of the challenges is we have completely imperfect language to talk about identity and who we are and all those kinds of things. So for some people, the religious label will be to do with a practice and a faith. For others, it will do more to do with your community background or a political or national affiliation and those kind of things. And they're kind of all rolled into one in some ways. So recognising we don't have perfect language to describe this, I think in part, we're talking about the 2 traditions and in whatever way you want to understand that. So for us, it is about bringing together, the 2 traditions, but it is about more than that. It is about other cultures and beliefs, other worldviews. It is about people from different socioeconomic backgrounds as well. So I think for us, the revised definition in the Act, for example, really reinforced things that we believe to be really important anyway. But I think people will have different views on where the emphasis should be. And I think, as we move forward, we know as well the numbers that don't identify as being from Protestant or Catholic traditions are increasing, and that's going to have to make us think more about how we do integration well.
Yeah, and I suppose given the changes in society here, the greater influx of people from other religions, other societies, and so on, integrated education may have been conceived at a time when there was a clear fault line in society here. That is changing, and we sort of need to move with the times. Would you agree with that?
I think it's both. I think it's about addressing, I don't think we're over that division, so I think we still need to address it, but absolutely we need to be really conscious and proactive in how we make sure schools are available and are welcoming and are inclusive, and where young people can see themselves in the school, no matter what their background is, and that's cherished.
Yeah. And I suppose it sort of leads on to what I want to ask about the issue of academic selection, and what is the view of the Integrated Education Fund in terms of academic selection. And I suppose I could put the question to you too, Barry, in terms of your school, which is a primary school. Where do the children from that school go after primary 7, and do you facilitate the setting of transfer exams? Do you give tuition within the school for that? And I suppose I better let you answer that question before I move on to the next part.
No worries, Pat. Yes, within our school, specifically the primary 7 teacher, primary 6 and 7 teacher does not teach to the test, because we feel that would be a disadvantage to the children who are not doing the transfer test. So I take them out, and that's going to be starting very soon, in preparation for November, December coming. But yes, luckily in our area we
Right, Barry, are you saying you take children who want to
Yes.
do the transfer test?
I take them for an hour a week. Yeah.
Right, okay.
And a lot of children who are doing the test would maybe get some tuition as well. And of course, some children can't afford that.
Apologies.
But there are, as I say, we don't teach to the test, but we do take some pupils out. Now, this year, for example, there was only 4 pupils. Okay. But luckily in the area we've got St Killian's, which is non-selective. We've got Lauren Grammar, which is non-selective. We have got Slemish College, and then there are other grammar schools in the area that do ask for a result in the transfer test. So we cover all options. I suppose because we can, and I just make myself available for that.
Yeah, I suppose the reason I'm asking that is because, you know, if a school really wants to be integrated and you identify, you know, fault lines within your education system, you know, the haves and the have-nots, you know, essentially, if children within an integrated primary school are being given tuition to go on to, you know, obviously grammar schools, because it's grammar schools, it's taking children with academic selection. Are you not, in a sense, helping to sustain those divisions within society, rather than, you know, really promoting your ethos of total integration?
No, I think we're doing both. You know, we are, as I said, the primary 6-7 class is not. They do not focus on the transfer test. They work through the P7 curriculum. It doesn't end until roughly May when they're in P7. If you're doing the transfer test, you need to know everything by, you know, probably by September to be able to be competent in those tests. So there's a very small percentage of our pupils would go for the transfer test. And in our school, we give parents the options to do that or not to do that. And that's just where I step in. And I think as an integrated school, being able to do that is, you know, is part of our ethos and what we do.
And Paul, just coming back to the issue of academic selection and integrated.
Let Sean come in on this.
Just ask for a brief answer.
Very
This is
brief. It's
times-
more than
times against us.
of nicely. So I think it's important to remember there are no integrated schools that are fully selective, Pat. I know that, and we can come on to there's some schools that are up top what is a bilateral approach, maybe 35% entry. If the principals of those schools were here, they could speak for themselves. But I think what I've heard repeatedly from them is while selection remains in place, then they also face challenges from parents and from local communities where the perception can still be that fully selective schools are somehow better than others. And so there's a competitive element to say if we're going to be all ability, then we need to have something in that. But I just want to do something very quickly, Chair, to explain why the integrated movement has been all ability from its inception, whilst acknowledging those bilateral schools. Because if we today were sitting in a room and setting up a children for our school in our local community, I bet it would be highly unlikely that anybody would come forward and say, well, let's set a school up together for everybody. But here, I've got an idea. You have to pass a test at the age of 11 to get in. I don't think anybody would, and that's when Lagan College was formed, and the other schools have formed on that basis. So, you know, we get criticised from both sides as well on this, but whilst the selection remains in place, I can see why some schools feel that they need to look at bilateral. But Sean?
We don't have a specific position on selection. Our position is schools should be all ability.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Thanks, Chair.
David, here next.
Thanks very much, Chair, and thanks for your presentation so far. I am going to delve in, probably unsurprisingly, to the issue with around Bangor Academy. and just ask you. We heard Sean say, and welcome to the meeting we had with Sean recently. But it is about bringing the two traditions together, and a conscious and proactive effort to do that. On that basis, what would you consider too small a number in terms of percentage to be a starting point for transformation to integrated status?
Well, yeah, in terms of start the process, it could be very, very low, because our experience is in the majority of schools that embark on the transformation process that they do increase whoever their minority enrolment might be. In Barry's case, his minority was the Protestant community. In the remaining cases, transformation would be the Catholic community. And the experience is that those schools post-transformation experience an increase in that minority enrolment. In some cases, very dramatically, very quickly. In others, it may be slow and gradual over a longer period of time. But the trend is most definitely upwards.
I mean, in the chamber, the minister, argued some of the things that should be done to try and build that percentage. But do you see where the challenge might be with 2.5 to 3% in an area where there already is schools in different sectors that are extremely integrated, if not by name? They do have a share of pupils from both communities, very successfully so.
Well, it's a competitive education system, and we know that. So I'm not going to crystal ball, but what I would say is, looking at demographics, looking at the data within both schools, there's most definitely room for them to reflect their local community, which see an increase in the proportion of the minority community. And our hope would be, as stated in the department's guidance, that the Department of Education will indeed help those schools that are transforming from a low percentage base.
We have in the infographic there reference to your Lucid Talk survey. Could I ask, was there any efforts to understand what people respond to that survey, or in general what people understand integrated education to be in that regard? Because I think we could probably agree that people, when they hear the words integrated education, do think of integration as being significantly more than 2.5-3%.
Yeah, well, the definition is in there in the polling, and there's a lot of questions and stuff like that. Probably, I know my colleague Paul prepared it, member, but I think that was one statistic of many questions that have been asked in and around that issue. And you always want to get as precise a question as you can in a survey. For example, if we look at the Northern Ireland Life and Time survey, they frame it in a perhaps more unhelpful way, which is, would you prefer to send your child to a mixed religion school? And I think your question in that, if that had been the question that was asked, I'd have some sympathy with that, but I think Lucid Talk is much, much more specific.
I guess my issue is that I'm not sure that the general populace do understand the difference between a school that has mixed religions and an integrated school. I'm not sure that understanding is out there. I understand that you understand it, and yes. I probably understand it more.
I agree with you, and I agree, and I think the department have agreed that they need to actually do work on that as well.
Yeah, I mean, we're hoping that there is an action in and around kind of public awareness campaign and that kind of thing, so hopefully that will follow. I suppose just to say, and we've talked about this previously, for us it is not about the starting point at 3%, it's about where you can go, and with a lot of hard work, a lot of aspiration, that you can build a school community that is reflective of the demographics of the local community, and that takes time. It is a journey, there's no doubt about that. So it's in that sense of hope, of intentionality. Many integrated schools started from a handful of parents coming together. Transformation started from only a handful of children from the minority community, and have built themselves up over the years. And that's what our position is, that it's not so much about the starting point, it's about where you can get to.
If I could maybe just talk about our journey very briefly. Before we transformed, our stats were 70% Catholic, 20% Protestant, 10% other, and now it would be 45% Catholic, 35% Protestant, and 20% other. So after transformation, there was definitely
I could understand that. I just thought the other is a particularly low point to be starting with. One more question if I can, Chair.
Yeah, very briefly.
I realise I'm racing through questions to try and fit some in, but I guess one thing that I raised with Sean, I'm interested, Sean can speak again, but just maybe if others want to as well. we previously, when the department were here to speak about integrated education, there was a map showing the location of integrated schools throughout Northern Ireland. Whilst I understand that there is more in terms of population density east of the Ban, it did seem very obvious that there was a concentration of integrated schools east of the Ban relative to west of the Ban. Could you speak to why you think that that is and what challenges there are in terms of attracting schools west of the Ban?
Ask it as brief as possible, just to keep the time. I know it's a tricky one.
Go ahead. I mean, David's
It's a really hard one to answer. But look at population. There's been a number of attempts at transformations at small rural schools. I think would be fair to say, David, to the west of the Ban. But if you look at Enniskillen, Omagh, Derry, Londonderry as well, there are integrated schools there as well. So a lot of it will be around major settlements. But there has been attempts in some of those schools. For example, St Eugene's, another Catholic school in Victoria Bridge. Not approved in terms of grounds of sustainability as well. But Sean, I don't know if there's any other quick answer to that. But
I don't know there is a set answer. I think, and I mentioned this to David before, one of the key things for us is in areas where there's particularly a lot of small rural schools potentially under threat of closure, that it's this kind of community conversation methodology might be the way to go. What are the needs of this area? What are you interested in? And we'd be hopeful that an integrated option might be one of those. It might not be, but we'd be hopeful that it would. So I think it's also to do with how we approach area planning and those wider issues.
Yeah. Thank you. Michelle, you'd indicate next.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks very much for your presentation. Loved your story, Barry. I think I've heard some of it before, but I think it's a really positive story, and it's great to hear the changes that have happened in your school and your community. Through your questions from David, we touched on the transformation process. So I'm aware there's the guidance is being reviewed at the moment around transformation. So I'm interested to know what role your organisations are playing in that review, and as people who are supportive of integrated education, what improvements do you think could be made to the guidance?
Perhaps I start. So we've been very active over the last number of months, working alongside the department and EA in developing a kind of more programmatic approach. I'm not sure again how much I can say because none of this is published, but what I'll say is that it really is to take the schools through a programme together as opposed to lots of schools transforming at different points, so that you can maximise your support and bring people together and kind of going on a journey together. So we've been very engaged. It's still at draft stage, it's not finished, so I can't really comment on once it's finished I can say more.
I think the Integration Works Guidance that was published, I think in 2019, was possibly the most positive document I've ever seen from the Department of Education, and whilst I understand the need to revise the guidance in light of the legislation 2022, I reiterate the point I made at the beginning. It staggers me how slow a process this seems to be. And if you're familiar with Section 10, the calls for transformation in the guidance were supposed to be published last autumn, and we're still waiting. And by the way, as a Section 3 organisation, no, we haven't seen any revision of any transformation guidance at this stage.
Yeah, and our development proposal case for change, it's like writing a thesis for a PhD. It's like there's a lot of work in it and a lot of people involved.
Yeah, that's great, thank you. You also touched on area planning. So I'd love to understand just what your role is right now as the integrated sector in area planning for our schools, and also in light of the proposal in the review of education, independent review of education around jointly managed schools, how that could all kind of knit together.
You go first.
So in terms of area planning, nicely have a seat at the area planning table at all levels. So that's the steering group, the work group and the local group. So we're there essentially to advocate for integrated education. We aren't the managing authority of any school, which is important to note. EA are the managing authority for controlled integrated schools, and in the case of a grant-maintained integrated, their board of governors are. However, we play a kind of representative role as well for those schools. So we are always looking at those various levels at opportunities to think about whether an integrated school might be an option. But to date, it's no secret that most area planning has been sectoral. So I think off the top of my head, there's been two cross-sectoral solutions, and if I'm wrong, apologies. Both in Coleraine was a voluntary and controlled school, and then, as Paul mentioned, Causeway Academy, which is 2 controlled schools and a grant maintained integrated school. So progress there in terms of that kind of collaborative work is slow, and we're always hopeful, but it's been slow.
It's still very much grassroots up rather than top down in terms of area planning for integrated education.
Yes.
Just again, I mean, I said this at an event when we launched our the latest Future Schools toolkit for post-primary schools. George Bain, 2006, sent a report forward for Northern Ireland. We're familiar with reports and not getting implemented. That's 2006, and then Cara Bloomer's report in the Independent Review, and this idea of jointly managed community schools. So, like everybody, I'd love to know what they look like. I think if we sat down with a blank sheet of paper and said, let's have a jointly managed community school, dare I say it, if we looked at the Board of Governance within a transformed integrated school with 2 places reserved for the transfers from the main Protestant churches and 2 for the Catholic side, I'd love to know what jointly managed community schools would be. I do understand, and I know some people might feel if we call them community or integrated schools, maybe that would be something that people would be difficult with from the outset. But we need to find out more about it, because the reality is we know we've got villages and towns throughout Northern Ireland. Glenarm's one of them, where the danger is we're going to see one school or another serving one side of the community or the other that's going to close, that's going to leave our community in those areas bereft of education provision. But the sooner we can start those conversations together to say, is there a different way forward? Is it possibly an integrated school? Could it be a jointly managed school, a joint faith school, a confederation, something? But something better than parents being told your local school is closing, and then people put up the Save Our School banners and a few examples. I don't mind saying this, but well, maybe we should go integrated. It's all far too late. So why can't we encourage these conversations and this work to begin? We know there's going to be a demographic downturn. We know what's coming. And I know politicians and everybody will find it really difficult. Nobody wants to see a school close in their local community. So let's work together, I think, to try and look at more innovative solutions. And whether it's 1 or 2, as Sean outlined, that's not good enough in 25 years. And in 25 years' time, will anything else have changed? I hope so.
That's interesting. I mean, you've got a role in area planning, but you don't have any decision making, and you're obviously...
We have no role to play, Sean would have.
Yeah. But I think there's sometimes a misperception out there, or maybe it has been actively promoted, that the integrated sector has its own management authority, is taken care of in a way that other schools aren't, but that's not really the case at all. You guys...
You can really only do something if there's parental demand. That's the bottom line. If there's going to be a transformation, it's parental demand. If a new school is going to be established, it'll be based on parental demand. But the ability to see integrated education as an area solution is something we're interested in pursuing, and jointly managed community schools, whatever that looks like. If we can find innovative ways to bring children together, in a shared ethos with shared governance, and the identities of all the kids are honoured and respected, I think we'd be very supportive of that, even if it's not formally integrated.
Draw a line at that point. Unfortunately, we're over time. That's great. Colin, you had indicated next.
Thanks, Chair, and can I thank the panel for their presentation today, and apologise for not being there in person to ask my questions directly to you. My sound's kind of playing up here in Ballymena, so I hope you can hear me. But my first question is, how do you view the role of integrated education in promoting reconciliation and community cohesion? And what's your plans for expanding integrated education in areas where it's currently underrepresented?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I suppose it's similar to some of the conversation with Pat earlier, in that, for us, integrated education is one of the most sustainable reconciliation initiatives there is, because once you get a school set up, you're really using mainstream funding to enable children to come together, to have conversation, to understand each other's traditions and identities. But it does much more than that, because it also brings parents together, because parents are obviously involved, particularly at primary level, in their child's education. Integrated schools have quite a big emphasis on parents' councils. There's more parent places on the Board of Governors. So in a sense, it is promoting social cohesion on a range of levels. And I think, you know, there's lots of literature that says in post-conflict society, schooling is one of the big things that can play a contribution to kind of transitional justice. So in terms of that, I think it's a massive contribution. That's not to say other schools can't also play a contribution, but for us, integrated education plays a really core one. The second part of your question was around expansion, growth. I mean, again, without the strategy being published, it's hard for me to go into specifics, but, you know, the Section 10 report laid in front of the Assembly talks about identifying areas where there's no provision. So reaching out into those communities and seeing if there's an interest, if there's a school that's interested in transforming, increasing awareness of integrated education will be part of that strategy. I think moving forward, part of that is the call for transformation that is in the Section 10 report as well.
All I can say, Colin, in relation to that, there only are a number of pathways available to creating an integrated school. Although it's not impossible, I think it's unlikely. We've seen over years where new schools will open driven by parents on the ground. And I say that just in terms of demographic realities and the number of schools that we face with low numbers right across the education system. Transformation, I won't go on about as Sean's outlined, remains the key route for growth. But as we've talked about Causeway Academy and Coleraine, I personally would love to see more cross-sectoral solutions where people are working together across sectors to say, let's sustain education for everybody in our local community. And naturally, from our perspective, that it makes sense that would be an integrated school. And thereafter, if there's other models that bring young people together where their cultures and identities are acknowledged and celebrated, well, we can look at those. But primarily, I think it's going to have to come through the transformation pathway.
Yeah, that's great, thank you. And then just following on from that, could you tell us a little about how you collaborate with both the maintained and controlled schools to promote shared education initiatives, and outline any barriers which may exist to greater cooperation between yourselves, maintained and controlled?
I'll start. Yes, it's. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Barry.
Yes. Well, obviously we're in the shared. We have shared education partners as well. I think we've got the perfect shared education partnership. We've got an integrated school, a Catholic school, and a Protestant school, for want of better terminology. And so, you know, the teachers and the principals have met, and we've decided what we're going to do and how we're going to plan the year. And all the pupils from P1 to P7 will be meeting each other 3 times this year. The only thing that we're struggling with is probably funding, because we're the other 2 schools are in Larne, we're in Glenarm, and we have to spend a lot of our money on transport. So, but it is working very well for us, and we also link in with the Catholic maintained schools when we're planning for some of the sacraments, and again that is something that we do, and we just continue to do. So I suppose it all depends on relationships and how you get on with people, and it seems to work very well for us.
I think it's your question's timely, because we've just done our return to the department on our duty towards shared education. I mean, one of the areas we've been working on recently is the development of learning resources that can be extended out. So taking some of the experience from integrated education and existing shared education partnerships and writing that up and distributing that as part of kind of teacher professional learning. So there's a watch this space on that one. We're very active. We work closely with the sectoral shared education and sectoral support part of the Education Authority. So we're in meetings with them all the time, exchanging information and knowledge. And I think at last count, again, don't quote me on this, because of the Aspire programme just coming on board in terms of shared education, I'm not sure where the numbers are, but I think about 2/3 of integrated schools were involved in a shared education partnership. So there's a fairly good vitality there.
Am I allowed to bring a negative in? just by example, because it's just a frustration and to share with the committee. If you look at the amount of financial investment, particularly made through the Peace Plus programme, which will be going in, the very much basis is that it's contact, and it's limited contact hours. together with NICE and ourselves, when we were talking to Peace Plus, you know, if you're an integrated school, there's an assumption, oh, you're all right then, you're doing all of this. You know, this is just bread and butter to you guys. But nobody realises how difficult and challenging it can be within a single institution when you're bringing diverse communities together. And so there's no additional support for that. You would have to partner with another school of another type. So I think sometimes that's a bit of a missed opportunity through some of the PEACE programmes, and maybe that the shared education should actually be broadened out so that integrated schools could avail of some of that support as well. And why I like a wee moan about it, it means that the Integrated Education Fund very much fills that gap, and we fund a lot of reconciliation and peace and trust building projects for integrated schools through our own fundraised money. So hope you don't mind.
And then
saying
just
that.
one last one quickly if we have time, Chair.
Unfortunately, we are
you-
definitely sorry, Colin. We are out of time. Unfortunately,
Okay, no worries.
that had run over. Apologies, Colin. Peter, you had indicated next there.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for your presentation this afternoon. I want to just start on the Lucid Talk poll, which my colleague mentioned, and I did manage to find the poll question, which IEF used, and I'll just read it out. Integrated schools, which intentionally educate children together every day in the same classrooms, inclusive of different religions, gender and race, should be the main model for our education system, and 67% said yes to that, and that's, you obviously we see this figure here. I'll just read it out again. 67% of people in Northern Ireland agree that integrated education should be the norm. Lucid Talk poll 2024. Can I ask your view, if you took the words integrated and intentional out of your question, schools which educate children together every day in the same classrooms, inclusive of different religions, gender and race, should be the main model for our education system, do you think the results would be different?
Yeah, I think the result would be different. If you took the word integrated education out, yes.
Integrated and intentionally, yeah.
If you took it out, yes.
And what way would it be? What way would it be different? Do you think the figure would be higher or lower?
I think it would be higher. Because there's another question that gets asked, which is basically, should all schools in Northern Ireland, irrespective of management type, be inclusive? I haven't got the exact word in front of me that you have, maybe, Peter. And that's a higher percentage.
Yeah.
So, and that's about the entire system. Should every school in Northern Ireland aspire to do that? So I would expect it to be higher.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I'm pushing towards the, it would be unusual for someone to say that, for example, schools should not be welcoming everyone, regardless of race, religion and gender. And I mean, would you accept that, for example, control schools, maintain schools, Irish medium schools do welcome all pupils regardless of religion, gender and race?
I certainly would like to think so, yes, I believe so.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yep.
There's no question of that. The last thing in our mind is criticising any teacher, school or institution who's doing its best to educate children.
Yeah.
100%.
That's fine. I'll move on to just a previous committee hearing, just to get your view on this as well. Again, my colleague stole all my best questions today. I referenced it earlier. So it was the recent decision in Ards and North Down regarding the two schools, and they were effectively the debate was around what percentage of Catholic population at the school would be reasonable, and we've talked about this so far. So the Deputy Secretary who signed off on the advice to the Minister eventually said, a colleague said, is there any number that you would have thought would have been low enough for you not to have considered first the duty to promote integrated education? Is there any number that you would have thought unreasonable? And the DepSec said 0. Would you agree with that assessment from that DepSec, that actually any school in Northern Ireland, even if its current population was maybe, I don't know, 80% Catholic, 20% other, or 90% Protestant, 10% other, could that be an integrated school?
Could it be? Yes.
Okay.
Could it be? Because we're looking to the future. We're not talking about, I think Sean outlined this earlier. If we're looking at a starting point,
Yep.
You know, that the facts speak for themselves. We look at our education system as a starting point. So less than 2% of children from who identify as Protestant attend Catholic maintained schools. Okay, these are not our data. This is in the Department of Education's data. In terms of controlled schools, less than, I think it's about, it might be going up a wee bit, but it's about less than 8% was the last one, 7.9% identify within, coming from a Catholic identity. But if a school is starting at a very low base, can they, over time, increase that number significantly? I think we've said they can, and there's evidence to show that they can. Because that's the commitment that the schools have made through their Transformation Action Plan. It won't happen overnight. But I think if we're looking at the starting point, we're looking at the wrong point. I mean, whether it's 3%, I know some integrated schools who have transformed, who've had a starting point where they've got a tremendous, what looks like a tremendous sort of balance between the two communities. And we've had other schools where their starting point is practically zero. You know, and I think, I mean, if you look at it in just a few years, and I know it came up perhaps in one of the committees before, look at Integrated College Glengormley, who, if you went back 5 or 6 years ago, I think at about 1% of the Catholic community were attending that school. This year, statistics from the Department of Education, in just 3 years, it's risen to 6%. But what I also want you to think about half of that school were pupils prior to transformation. So there's been definite increase happening in what I would call year 8 and year 9 within the school. So I think there's lots of examples, but we won't shy away from challenges or where things could be better, or and schools in local demographic situations that will definitely impact. And I agree with the Minister when he said, you know, there's going to be grey areas. Yeah, if you look at the decision, it's, you know, we don't want a one size fits all, and we need to take account of local demographics. That's very pragmatic.
Okay, no, thanks, Paul, for that. I'm going to pick up on the point that Pat made right at the start.
Just be briefly, Peter.
Yeah, no, it's fine, Chair. Integrated education, I'm reading from the Integrated Education Act 22. Integrated education means the education together in an integrated school of those of different cultures and religious beliefs and of none, including reasonable numbers of both Protestant and Roman Catholic children or young people. Now, that's what it says in the legislative text. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't say reasonable numbers in the future. It doesn't say that it should aspire to reasonable numbers of Protestant and Catholic children. And obviously we're about to scrutinise a piece of legislation ourselves. The text is very important. So do you accept that actually on the basis of the Integrated Education Act, the Minister took a view that actually there was no way that at this point in time, 3%, that reasonable numbers had been achieved in order to give the school...
Absolutely, yeah.
No is the short answer. The article the Minister made the decision under doesn't, in our view, doesn't require the school to have all this by day one. That would be our reading of it. Mm-hmm. The Minister has a different reading, but part of the issue here is how the process was constructed. Is that when the approval is given, it is legally an integrated school, and it can take time. Transformation is a journey, so it'll take time to grow in that reasonable numbers and I think for me, given there is no halfway house, and I think I mentioned this before, there was an experiment around kind of conditional approval at one point, but it didn't have any legislative basis. So while we still have this system, I think it's the job. It falls under encourage, facilitate and support. So in the interim period, there's monitoring done, there's support given to the school around achieving a reasonable balance, not just in terms of Protestant Catholics, but also thinking about their overall balance, their ability and socio-economic status as well, and that support is given over a period of time. And then at some point in time, maybe there needs to be a decision made as to whether you can still stand over that. But that's the system we have, and I think we have to make the most of it. So for me, it's to be as proactive as we can, rather than to deny in the first place.
Yeah, and I think the parents' wishes
I have to
and
just draw a
desires
line,
are
very
very
unfortunately.
important too.
Apologies, just on time. I'm going to bring Danny in now.
Thank you, Chair. And I only have the one question, so thank you, panel. You touched on it earlier, it was the independent review of education, and it recommended a single management system for our education here. The Education Minister is intent on ignoring that recommendation and establishing another managing authority for the control sector. Would you care to comment on that, or any criticisms or any concerns you may have on that there, or welcome it?
I suppose, you know, when we submitted to the Independent Review of Education back in 2022, we had a belief that we could construct a single body with a number of sectoral support bodies ingrained in that. Now, we didn't draw like plans for it, but that was our rough view. And I think our view would still be that the most cost-effective trajectory is to do that. So we agree wholeheartedly with the objective of what's happening with regards to Controlled Schools Management Authority. All schools should be really well supported. Controlled schools should be really well supported too. I think probably our preference would be that it would be done as part of a larger body. But you know, if this is the direction, perhaps a few years down the line, we can then think again about how do we bring bodies together into some kind of single system.
I agree. You know, we've been long proposed to say, you know, for a country, I know what we're at now, 1.8, 1.9 million people, we need one single body that can embrace everything. So
just caveated that schools that sit outside of a managing authority at the moment would have the option to opt into that. They wouldn't be forced to. Yeah.
Great.
Thank you.
I know that just the one question then, that's great. So I don't have any other indications. So thank you all for your time today. We really do appreciate it, and particularly making the journey from Glenarm, Barry. We appreciate that.
Okay, I live in Bangor.
That's controversial.
I'll say nothing.
Very close to a certain school.
But we will certainly have material there that we can raise with the department when they are up before us in our later evidence session. So thank you all for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So while the witnesses make their way out, I'm going to suggest we probably don't have any actions arising from that. I think probably a lot of it will carry through to the evidence session with the department, unless members have any other suggestions.
Just the question that Colin had, maybe he could provide to me. And
yes, if Colin wants to
follow
provide
up.
that in writing, and we can
and if
follow
anybody
up.
else got cut off due to time, I think there might have been someone else.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, so that moves us on to item 7 on the agenda, which is a briefing from the Integrated Alumni Charity. So I would refer members to their table papers where there is a briefing there from the Integrated Alumni, and I would invite our witnesses to just come forward. And so just while they're getting seated, I can introduce that today we have Dr. Matthew O'Neill, who is the chair of the Integrated Alumni with us, and Amelia Kai, who is the project and development manager with the alumni. So you're both very welcome here today. Thank you for giving up your time to the committee. I know that you had approached committee with an interest, particularly in the light of the decision around the two Bangor schools, but I think it's a fairly open session in terms of anything you want to bring to us. So I'll hand over to yourselves at this stage for any initial remarks or presentation that you want to make of up to 10 minutes, and then we will move into question and answer from there. So over to yourselves.
Perfect.
Just wanted to open up with an opening statement and then jump right into questions. So first of all, thank you, Chair, thank you, Deputy Chair, thank you to the members of the committee for the opportunity to address you today. It's a great privilege for us. I'd also like to take a moment to thank the committee clerks for working with us to get us here. I know they put a lot of effort and time in emailing back and forth, so it's very much appreciated. I'm also delighted to be joined here by my colleague Amelia, who's our Projects and Development Manager. And it's a privilege to be here to discuss the work we do and our shared perspectives, and offer our shared and lived experience of integrated education in Northern Ireland. For the record, I went to Hazelwood Integrated College, followed by North Coast Integrated College, and Amelia went to Slemage College. So Integrated Alumni is a voluntary membership-based organisation. We're dedicated to championing the values and vision of integrated education in Northern Ireland. We are comprised of former students and supporters. We provide a platform to the alumni of integrated schools to stay connected and share their lived experience of integrated education in Northern Ireland. In Northern Ireland, I think we all can agree, education is more than a tool for individual achievement. It is a cornerstone of our society and a bridge towards a more collective future for us all. As someone who has long believed in the power of education to heal wounds and foster understanding, the past while I've been struck by the urgency and responsibility as a society we all have to bear in shaping the discourse around our education system in itself. At present, there are only 76 schools out of over 1,000 in Northern Ireland are formally designated as integrated, serving around roughly 8% of the population of pupils. This reflects a slow incremental growth since the first integrated school, Lagan College, was established in 1981. The integrated education movement itself arose as a grassroots response to the single sector schooling that often mirrored and perpetuated our societal divides. With a clear mission to educate students from different religious, cultural and social economic backgrounds together in a single inclusive environment. This ethos is very important to me and our members, and it is underpinned by our core values of equality, mutual respect and reconciliation, ensuring that students grow up not just with academic knowledge, but with the social skills to navigate a plural society. This ethos is intentional, and you'll hear that again and again today. It is inclusive and rooted in shared values that transcend religious and cultural lines, as well as social economic. While integrated education offers clear benefits, it must coexist with respect for parental choice. Families in Northern Ireland can choose from controlled schools, Catholic maintained schools, Irish medium schools and more. Each of these sectors reflect deeply held cultural or religious identities. Expanding integrated education to meet the growing demand must be a priority, but this need not come at the expense of those other sectors. Indeed, we should foster a collaboration and partnership in learning across all schools is something that we have. And our perspective does come from that ethos. Because when young people learn together, they learn to see one another not as the other, but as neighbours, as friends, and as equals. And going back to the growing discussion around integrated schools, we are hearing more about naturally integrated schools, on the other hand, develop organically as a result of demographic changes rather than deliberate policy or community efforts. Integrated education is a conscious rejection of this separation, offering a model of learning where shared values take precedence over inherited divisions. This approach does not erase identity, but instead provides a framework for young people to understand and respect each other's background without feeling the need to confirm a single narrative. In a society still navigating the complexities of post-conflict reconciliation, the ethos of integrated schools is vital in fostering a generation that does not view difference as a barrier, but as an enrichment. It challenges us to reconsider what education should achieve, not just academic excellence, but the ability for children and young people to live, learn, and lead together. The narrative around integrated education often fears into polarisation, and it's something as an organisation we are very worried about. It seems to be about proponents versus opponents, unity versus division, hindering any meaningful discussion. And we believe the committee has a role to play in developing a discussion around all education system in Northern Ireland, not just honing in on one sector. In a divided society still healing from conflict, it is tempting to frame debates in terms of winners and losers. Language shapes our actions. It carries the weight of our history, culture and course of direction. In a society as historically divided as ours, we must tread carefully in how we talk about each education sector and what education means to us. I remember when I was at Hazelwood learning about how Protestants revered the Irish language in the 19th century. While learning, forgive my Irish, it's not very good, I tried, a couple of fucula while we were doing it. I don't protest any fluency, so please forgive me on that one. Or learning about the Dublin-born leader of the Ulster Scots poetry, George Francis Savage Armstrong. It is from these experiences we were taught to choose our words carefully and thoughtfully. We can build bridges rather than walls, fostering a dialogue founded in our complexity of common purpose, one which is the best of what we aspire to be. It should be whether our education system as a whole prepares our children to navigate a complex, interconnected world. In Northern Ireland, education is not just a policy issue, it is a deeply personal and profoundly social matter. However, integrated education offers a proven model for building bridges across divides, but its expansion must be accompanied by respect for the preference of individuals and parents who find their values reflected in the integrated education itself. Our society has seen the cost of division, but we have also seen the extraordinary resilience of communities that choose to come together. Integrated education is one of the most powerful steps towards a society that is not just peaceful, but truly united in purpose and in the promise of our most valued citizens, our next generation. So in closing, committee, we would like to urge your support for the implementation of the Integrated Education Strategy. While we await the strategy's release for consultation, we request sufficient time in the future for different stakeholders to be able to provide feedback and encourage the committee to engage with its contents through thoughtful questioning and what could mean the impact for its actual delivery in the details on that. And I know yous will do that, undoubtedly. So I just want to take an opportunity again to say thank you very much. And it is a privilege for me and Amelia to be here again, and happy now to take your questions.
Thank you. And look, it's great to have an opportunity to hear your perspective again from individuals who've been through the integrated system in your own education. Look, I'm going to ask this question with a degree of trepidation, as this maybe takes us into quite complex territory. But I think from individuals who have been through the system, it would be good to hear your perspective. We've had a fair bit of chat today around sort of religious balance and how that should be worked out. One of the biggest changes that we've seen in Northern Ireland over the last number of years is the growth in the demographic who don't define as Catholic or Protestant or Unionist or Nationalist, that phrase other, which I'm not that keen on, but that's sort of how it tends to land. Given that integrated education sort of grew as a movement really out of a conflict society with quite binary divisions, how do you think the integrated movement needs to respond to that sort of changing demographic, and how we can make sure that integrated schools are inclusive to the multiplicity of identities within Northern Irish society?
I'll speak first and then allow Amelia to come in, because I know she'll be able to ask. As an organisation, we probably take a more pluralist view. I was really happy to hear Pat's question in the previous panel around social economic status. We would be content with the idea of the definition being expanded to include that. And in fact, if you look at the legislation, I know we've talked about Section A around the different communities in that sense, but I think we've forgotten to talk about Section B and around the economic section, and then as well Section C around all abilities, and that's been sort of left out of the discussion. So I feel like a framework's there. It's more about how do we reframe that is my mind in having that discussion. I can't really speak to the other, because I'll be very much open with the committee. I come from a very much a unionist background, and in my mind integrated education allowed me to really be robust in that and allow me to engage and explore that and explain that. But I know Amelia has a different experience that would speak to this.
Yes, so as you can tell from my accent, I was not born here, but my mother is from Northern Ireland and my father is from Sierra Leone, West Africa. My father was Muslim and I moved over here. I went to a controlled primary school because there was no integrated school for me when I moved over here, and then I went to Slemish Integrated College. I cannot talk about the experiences of any sectors outside of integrated education, because that is my only experience. My son goes to an integrated school, my siblings went to an integrated school. But what I do know is from the friends that I've made when I went to Queen's University Belfast about their experiences, about the Catholic schools that they attended and how they were very different to my own experiences. I think, again, like Matt said earlier, highlighting what Pat had asked earlier as well about the reflections of the society that we live in Northern Ireland now, I think it's very important to factor in that so much of the focus is on between this whole idea of two sides, two halves, while we also understand that, the background and the percentage of people coming from outside of Northern Ireland, living within Northern Ireland, has grown substantially, even from the 2001 census as well. And I do think that we as an organisation believe that the definition of integrated education, of course, we would like that to be more expansive, to be more inclusive of everyone. But we also understand that integrated education itself as an ethos is the idea of bringing together Catholics and Protestant children to learn together. But I have seen in my own anecdotal experience within my school, within my son's school, they celebrate multiple holidays, like for example now being Eid in my son's school, they'll be having an own closed day because the only Muslim child in that school is in my son's class, and so they'll be paying respects and they'll be honouring that holiday as well.
Great, thank you for that. And I suppose I'll ask a more open-ended one, just to close from me. In terms of just looking forward, you've talked about maybe the need to expand the definition. You've talked about being keen to see the strategy coming forward. What would you see over the next number of weeks and months? What the challenges and opportunities are for integrated education in terms of growth and development?
I'll be honest, it depends on the strategy, and I know you'll hear this time and time again. The challenge is growth. I mean, when I went to Hazelwood, it was only 4% of schools were integrated at the time. Now, as I said, of the student population now, it's 8%. If my math is right and we go with that percentage, it'll be roughly around 250 years if we were to get to 50% of integrated schools. So the implementation is incredibly hard. I think the strategy offers us a pathway for that. The challenge is, of course, as we all know, living here, is building the consensus. But the opportunities is if we can gain a cross-party consensus. And I think that would be very important, and what integrated education should mean in that strategy and its implementation would be very helpful into how we actually work together and work towards and getting it implemented. But again, strategies, you'll hear again, is really, really important just to have and be able to have something to work with and engage with.
Yeah, I would be in agreement with Matt about being able to see the strategy as well. And I mean, in regard to what we would like to see for integrated education moving forward, again, we think about infrastructure and people's ability to get to these integrated schools. We do need to consider people coming from different socioeconomic backgrounds, and we also need to consider the percentage of those people and what their backgrounds look like. We have seen such a high growth in asylum seekers and refugees coming to Northern Ireland as well, and we need to factor those people in, because the reality is when they're going to a school, they're not necessarily thinking about what sector is this school from. And so we then need to think about the future of Northern Ireland and how that can reflect it, which is why, again, it's very important that we, as supporters of integrated education, I'm very vocal about this, we are very mindful in knowing that over 13% of our population now comes from ethnic minority backgrounds, versus in 2001 it was less than 1%. So we just need to maintain that idea as well moving forward. But again, we do need to know what's going on with the strategy before we can figure out our way forward as well.
We have the department in straight after you guys, so
Yeah.
no doubt that will be it will be a question. No, that's great. Thank you both. I'll bring the deputy chair in now at this stage.
Thanks, Chair. I suppose just a general question. It's probably following on from next. How do you assess the progress made since the introduction of the Integrated Education Act?
You'd come with the tough questions, Pat. How do we assess progress?
Well, I mean, do you notice any difference? Because the intention was that it would make a big difference.
In my mind, it has. Beforehand, we didn't have any. We had limited legal protections, but it was a stepping stone. So in being able to have a framework to work from and start to engage more critically with on the issues and get past what the definition is and then start working towards going forward, to me that is progress. It is in that terms. But since the implementation, I found, and I'm sure as we've heard beforehand, you heard from IAF and NICE, progress has been slow around the implementation, developing the priorities, what's the direction of travel since the Act itself and developed. So one base is, having that legal framework and developing it to try and get it to the now is progress, but then trying to move that forward and what the objectives are and trying to grow integrated education, it has been slow.
Do you feel, and I know the term has been used recently in another context, but do you feel the integrated education movement is operating in a hostile environment?
If you want to.
I'm happy to come in on that. The whole idea of integrated education is part of a peacekeeping process and reconciliation as well. I do believe that in my work with alumni, which I'm into my second year now as well, obviously the mother of an integrated child and an ex-integrated alum myself, but also coming from a very mixed background outside of the realms of Protestants and Catholics too, I think that a lot of the discourse surrounding integrated education is that we are selective, that we are vehemently against the other education sectors, and that we believe that our form of education is the only way forward. And to that, I would just like to bring in the fact that if we look at SEND and how it's, not part of the sectors at all, but we look at how those children are all learning together regardless of their backgrounds, regardless of contributing factors there as well, and it works. Now, if we were to then question, well, why does that work? It's not. If these children who have special educational needs and development are thriving in these environments, then we need to come back to the question, well, why aren't we seeing more of that in other sectors as well, where arguably there is such a divide within the amount of children that are there?
No, just to add that, like in my opening remarks, I did talk about the discourse, and I do think it has become a much more difficult environment to operate in, and that's why I thought it was important today to talk about like the discourse around integrated education and expand it, and that it isn't an us versus them. It's very much is about how can we have an inclusive conversation, everybody together around that.
Okay, thanks very much. Thank you
very much, Pat.
Thank you, Pat. David, you were next.
Thanks very much, sir. I actually welcome the tone in which has been this session's started, in the sense that it can seem, and both from our side at times when you're pushing against that it's adversarial, and it's not. I think what we have tried to position ourselves is to try and speak about actually the fact that some of those values which integrated education hold, some of us see reflected in the rest of our schools as well, and some of that diversity that you're talking about, particularly I think of schools in South Belfast and where there's a concentration of people from new communities. I think of in my own constituency, or serving my own constituency, Dundonald High School, Breda, between 20 and 26, I think, different languages spoken in each of those schools, and some of that diversity, and we see that inclusive. And I think some of those schools, not those two in particular, but some of those schools push back a little when they hear what is an integrated school, and there's talk of inclusiveness and diversity, and how that's deliberate in integrated schools. I accept that, but would you accept that some of that work is being done in other sectors as well?
If I could speak related to my own experience, I think yes, that work is being done, and this is where I was talking about. I think in our media discussion, in our politics, the conversation stops here, and then when we get to your question, we don't get the time to dig into that nuance, and that's what I really think is important, that we get a chance to dig into that. It's not a case that other schools aren't doing it. When we talk about the intention, there is a set out framework ethos that's there, that's implemented. Like for me, going to school, we used to have peace days, where we would take a day out of the year and everybody would be able to bring something that was very important to them. Now, I know I grew up in a different time, but I'm just going to use that experience, okay? So people would bring in their white lilies to explain that. Other people would bring in their poppies. People would bring in different flags, Rangers and Celtic and football tops, and we took the time to explain, to understand why that is important. I understand when people maybe get annoyed when we bring that up, and it's not to say that they aren't diverse and they don't have that. We just think it's important to have that intention. And if there's a way to take the integrated ethos about that framework to offer a toolkit or a framing for those schools to adopt, to give those people in those schools to have a chance to have those conversations, to really engage in that groundwork and to have that intention, that's something we would really welcome. That's where I would like us to get to.
I accept some of that. I think some of those discussions that have been that you're referring to, I had during my education in a controlled grammar, and what I would say is that, and I don't mean I'm going to draw to the Bangor Academy issue in the sense that I don't know what the makeup of my school was. I imagine it wouldn't have been too far from 2.5% to 3% in terms of representation of the minority community. You know, those conversations can happen in those sectors as well, and some of those sectors, we talked about St Colum's Banos, for instance, you know, where there is 40%, I think, from a Protestant background, despite it being a Catholic maintained school. I just think that there is very good work being done in integrated schools. Lagan College serves my constituency very well, but what we're pushing back against is some of that work is done in those other sectors as well, and can be done even with smaller populations of a minority community. It can even be done in schools that have a very low or zero from a minority community, which we heard at a previous committee meeting is enough for some department officials to say a school could transfer.
I mean, again, I'm hearing what you're saying, but I would invite you to come again, all of you, to come again to more integrated schools to see that intention.
Hoping to visit Lagan soon.
What I like to hear. That's what I like to hear, to actually see that intention. I'm more focused on the framework to allow that discussion, because I know we talked about numbers, but again, different groups could have had different numbering in the schools when we're going back to it. But it's because we literally took that time. Hazelwood was built with when I went there, was built with complete intent, to the colours that were selected, to the assemblies that we took, to the fact that we learnt Ulster Scots and Irish at the same time to understand what that meant. And I know those schools are doing, but they weren't originally built of that intent. That's not taken away. They don't have it. My question would be back, do you think, my question would be going back, how can we support them further to build that shared or that integrated ethos in that school? It may not have an integrated label,
I think we should do that in all schools.
What can we do to get that in all schools?
You know, my issue is just what people perceive the label to be, and what that also says about schools that don't have that label in that respect.
If I could ask about the label, and probably one reason why I'm very passionate about it, in the future I would be happy to let it go. I'm speaking in personal capacity about integrated, if we could have all schools be integrated essentially in the future. The reason why I'm attached to it right now, kind of going back to Pat's question, I do feel the debate's gotten toxic, and I don't want to see the work that we've done be taken, because everything has been done by grassroots. And when you're going through such a long process, 1981, to get 73 schools out of over 1,000, it can build, you can build a bit of protection about it. I'm not saying we can't move and have that discussion, but I think we can, and working towards that.
Can I ask, because I'm going to be close, I'm going to be closed off, and for either of you, do you think that if we have a significant number of schools transferring at a sub 5%, say, rate of, in terms of the number of minority community being there seeking to transfer to integrated status, would you worry at all that would dilute the authenticity of the integrated brand and what people think that means?
No, can I speak and then allow me? I wouldn't be worried, because if I'm being honest, we would probably be more on the open-minded side around the debate, around the definition, because we are the lived experience, we are the product. I mean, even going back to when I went to school, we very much had a diverse range of assemblies in which we had Buddhists, Sikhs, so many people from different minority backgrounds coming in and taking the time to explain to us. So I know that's happening and that's going on. I don't think it would be worried around diluted. I think it's where we're at now, because Northern Ireland is a society that's changing. We're moving, I think we're stepping out away of that sort of populism we had as being a post-conflict society and moving into some form of a normal functioning democracy. That we're having this tension in that we had sort of the traditional community still there and a new expanding community is coming in, and we're seeing that changing dynamic. And I think we just have to be very careful how we have that discussion, but I don't think it would dilute it. I think it would only make it stronger. I'll let Amelia come in and then we'll... Sorry, Chair.
No, Amelia, come in and
yes,
then we'll...
I want to point to your earlier point. I think the reality here is, especially, we're sitting with the Committee for Education, is we care about children's welfare. All of us. That is one thing that brings all of the education sectors together, is that we care about children's welfare. And in response to what you were saying about us when we're talking about the ethos of integration, at the end of the day, the word integration in Northern Ireland has a very specific definition. Obviously, integration worldwide in the English language has a different definition, but here it is an ethos. So when you said earlier with IEF and NICE that a lot of schools are already integrated, no, they're not, because they have not gone through the transformation process and they don't have that ethos in place. However, that is not us gatekeeping it, because if they are incredibly diverse, that is a wonderful and beautiful thing. My question to that would then be, those schools within those sectors, what are they then doing to encourage the cultural exchange of those higher percentages of people from outside of those sectors? Because that is what we need to foster, and that is what we need to look after as well.
I would say some of that's already happened, but thank you very much. Thank you.
No problem. Michelle, you'd indicated next.
I mean, thank you for your presentation. I have to say, I was nearly clapping at the end. It was a great speech. It was great. I think this has been a really positive discussion. I think I had questions. A lot of it's been touched, so I don't usually do it this way, but I'm going to probably just reference a number of things and let you guys... I think you've got an opportunity here today to kind of... There's a few myths out there about integrated education. There's misperceptions. Sometimes it might even float into misinformation. And it would be great for you to have this platform just to correct anything that's outstanding really today that you think we haven't touched on. So I've noted just a few bits here, and you can really take those wherever you want to. One thing I'll say immediately is this idea that we don't believe, or anybody who supports integrated education is critical or suggesting that it doesn't happen in other schools. I just want to reject that. I know that work is happening in other schools. I think you know that work is happening in other schools. I think we've just got a bit of discourse around integrated education has become quite divisive, and I think you've touched on that as well about proponents and opponents, and that has not been helpful. So a few things that you've said that I've highlighted that I think are worth just circling back on. So you made a comment about integrated education, and you spoke to your own identity does not erase identity, and I think that's really important and doesn't confirm any single narrative. And I know even one of the elections that I stood at, I think there was representatives on the ticket who went to Lagan College from Sinn Féin, from Alliance. There was somebody from the Green Party. There was a representative as well on the ticket whose kids from the Ulster Unionist Party who went to Lagan College. So I think perhaps a fear or myth or a concern that integrated education will turn us all into some kind of homogenous group of people without any diversity is not what's manifesting in reality at all. You talked about expanding the definition of integrated, and I think one of the words I wrote down, and you picked it up yourself, was around SEN and SEND, and that whole expansive definition and the growth of SEN. I think integrated education more generally can play a really important part in that. And one word that has come up, I think, I have two other things to raise. One word that's come up today more than I think I've heard at all in the Assembly in my time here is reconciliation. We never hear it mentioned, we never hear it discussed, and yet in this session I've heard reconciliation said several times really positively, and I think it's something that we need to hear more often in our discourse generally. And the last thing was just around ethos. So we've talked around ethos generally, but one thing we haven't really get into, we've talked about how it presents in the schools, but how it presents in the governance. In an integrated school, I think, is really important, perhaps something, again, that's not understood. So I've thrown a lot at you there, but you pick up what you think's worth picking up in terms of anything, again, you think is out there that's not understood, even around funding, that you think would be worth addressing before the platform's gone.
I could go first, and then Amelia will come in first. If I could touch on saying, don't let the title Dr. Philly, I'm very badly dyslexic and neurodivergent. I went to a controlled primary school, and I didn't get a chance to do my 11 plus because there wasn't it wasn't well resourced enough to give me the chance to be able to have a scribe to write out the exam for me. So I didn't get a chance to go to a grammar school. That was immediately taken away from me at that time. To give you a reference, that was the year 2000. I really welcome what the Minister wants to do in transforming SEN, and I think that's a really positive step, and is left out of the conversation at times in the whole schooling when we're talking about integrated and all the discussion we've had, and I really think we're getting a step. The reason why I mentioned that is when I went to an integrated school, because there was such a conscious effort in the intention of the ethos to not to other people, that was a natural step, that I was able to get the access I needed to the people to try transcribe my exams. I dictated them, or to engage the extra support I could to go around that. And that was a very important thing for me. And that's why I'm so very passionate about integrated education, because I think it can be a vehicle for social and economic change for those who have been left behind in our society when we talk about reconciliation. And it's something I don't think we've engaged enough in to talk about who hasn't seen the benefits of the peace dividend. And that's, in my mind, that's why it's so important. You talked about governance. I'm on a board of governors of an integrated primary school, and I'm one of the foundation governors. So that means there's a selection of governors that will talk around ethos and think very critically. And the big thing we recently thought about was religion in school and how it was taught versus instruction versus teaching in sort of like a critical thinking. Now we changed the scope of that, and we worked with NICE and the IEF as a school and Aptus and others to get that done. So that shows the power of having people who think of that and really think critically at every meeting when we go around that. You mentioned, I'll finish off my comments, sorry Michelle, if you mentioned about the identity. Again, I'm very much a proud unionist. I've no fear to say that. In the alumni group, it just shows you that we have people who would be part of the DUP, UUP, SDLP, Alliance, Sinn Féin, and some other political parties, and we are very much joint in this idea of integrated education and this integrated ethos. So we come together in that discussions and work around that. It isn't there's one group or political system in doing that, and the reason why I say that, integrated education gave me a chance to really understand my unionism, my background in being the unionist loyalist Protestant community, allowed me to engage it, but it made me more robust in that I was able to go out and explain exactly what it meant to me. because I was challenged in a constructive manner, I should say, not in a deconstructive manner, and that was really important to me. Sorry. So I'll let Amelia come in with her experience in a moment.
No, just to reiterate what Matt said as well, I believe that cultural exchange is what fosters individuality as well. I mean, Slemish's quote is learning together for individual success, and I think that extends to multiple parts of identity too. I am an autistic woman, and I didn't get diagnosed until after I'd finished the education process, but my son is autistic as well, and so SEND is very, very important to me, and having that. Now I know that SEND in all schools as well, every sector of schooling, that you have those SEND children there in those mainstream schools as well, and I think that is so incredibly important. But I just want to go back to my earlier point, which is that I personally, being born outside of Northern Ireland, being a second-generation immigrant, having a Muslim father and a Protestant mother, being neurologically and physically disabled myself, the thing that I care about most is making sure that every single child in this country feels comfortable with the school that they're going to. Obviously, we fully understand that not everybody has access to the specific schools. That was why we would like more integrated schools so that people have that access as well. But I think in an ideal world, so that we're not having these conversations and people aren't being misconstrued and misunderstood in what they're saying, in an ideal world, we wouldn't have any sectors because all of the schools would be reflective of the people living in Northern Ireland. And I personally believe that integrated education is a stepping stone to that future. That is what I believe. And that is not to say that other schooling sectors are hindering moving forward. I just believe, as part of the peacekeeping process and reconciliation, that integrated education is the way that we can move forward to ensure that all children are fostered within their individual cultures.
Both. Peter, you were next.
Thank you very much. I should point out that the chair promised me he'd be finished today by 4:30, and in an effort to try and keep him to that, I've only got one question. I have to say I find this session really interesting and very informative. I'm going to keep on the sectoral stuff, which we're just touching on there, and Amelia just mentioned it. So the Integrated Education Act puts a duty on the department to encourage, facilitate and support. And the Education Northern Ireland Order 98 puts a duty on the department to encourage and facilitate the development of Irish medium. And CCMS have a managing authority themselves, and the control sector rely on, obviously, EA and have a sectoral body themselves. Can you, given the fact that the highest duty that the department has is in terms of integrated education, okay, encourage, facilitate and support. The secondary one is Irish medium, and then it's controlled and maintained. Can you understand how other sectors may feel that, you know, the department's main focus, let's say, or key duty in terms of legislation would be on integrated education in Northern Ireland?
Short answer, yes. And the reason why we actually have that ability and the cognitive ability, I'm going to come back to it and say, is because we got the integrated education ethos. The whole point of that ethos is for us to take time to understand differing views and how do we work constructively together on that. So I can understand how outside that other different sectors may be annoyed, upset, or everybody wants their school or their belief to be at the top because resources are limited. We have issues with SEND teachers in this country, or SEND supports, and we need to have a guiding unitary distraction. But what I would say is, again, I think the reason why we've campaigned so hard for it is that not one school has been built by the department. All 76 have been pushed by parents and that democratic choice, and that's why we work so hard. The other thing I would say, if we take this out and put it in perspective, we only account for 8% of the student population. I mean, we're even a smaller outfit than IC and IEF in going about it. We have limited resources, and we have to be able to move or whatever we can in going about that. So in terms of your final question, short answer, yes, we do understand it. But one thing I say as an organisation, we welcome to engage with anybody from any sector to have a robust discussion on how we can have collaboration and how we can engage and what we as an organisation can do and support completely.
Yeah, I would just echo what Matt said, and I would also say if it was prioritised, we would be a much larger sector than we are, and we wouldn't have so many issues with the implementation of the Act as well. But again, I can fully understand why people would believe that.
Excellent. Thank you so much for your question, Peter.
Well, I'm going to.
I'm
I'll
not
sneak a
inviting
comment.
another question
I'm going to
unless you
sneak
really
a
want to.
comment.
Oh,
There
you
you
really want
go.
to. Let's go.
Never trusted the UP. So it's just to say. I mean, I think that's been Hansarded. Don't worry, and somebody will quote it back to me in the election campaign in 2027.
This isn't a separate question, by the way.
So no.
We strike that.
Definitely not.
The terms
Definitely
of
not.
reference for the question.
So it's just to say, I mean, I think, and it's been touched on in this session. I think there is I think a lot of other schools and a lot of other sectors would have, for example, a Christian ethos, or an ethos that promotes, kindness, respect, love for one another. These are the values that we've done RSE here. So and that straddles. It doesn't matter whether you're going to a control school or a maintain school. That sort of ethos is in all of those schools, and I suppose it's probably just to say, and David sort of touched on this, that actually I think and Amelia mentioned it earlier. I think every school in Northern Ireland has got children right at the heart of them, and certainly about just giving that single child the absolute best start it can with the best education and putting in place really sound values that will stay with that child for the rest of their lives. So that's maybe just more to put it on the record. But Matt, feel free to come back to me.
I could respond. Very quickly. Your policy document, No Child Left Behind, was a huge influence for me going in and campaigning for integrated education, because your second bullet point was on ethos.
Thank you. That's very kind to say that.
And I completely agree with you. What I would say in response...
Somebody's read it. Look.
Somebody's read. What I'd say to you is, yes, it's there, it's happening, but how can we create a framework that support those schools to do it? And integrated education has a model that's there that could be readapted for those different sectors, so the teachers are supported in having those conversations and delivering those shared values. That would be my response. If it's there, then we need to support it, we need to resource it, and we need to give them the space to have the same chances in terms of understanding that difference that integrated education students get. Thank you so much, Peter.
His soundbite was better for us than yours.
Was it really? Hansard never listened to these sessions anyway. I mean, the chance of that ever being recorded.
We won't let you forget, Peter.
No, the guys at Hansard are having a field day now, having to write all this stuff down.
Okay.
Sorry.
I'm just checking. I don't think we have any other indications at this stage. So I think that's bringing our session to a close. I mean, other than to say a big thank you for your time. I think it's been a really, really helpful, really enlightening evidence session. So thank you both.
No, thank you so much for making the time. Thank you for your questions, and thank you for the continuous engagement. As an organisation, we really appreciate it, and reaching out to anybody in the different parties and different members in this committee. So thank you again so much for having us. It was an absolute pleasure.
Thank you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm going to hardly write speeches. That's great.
Break.
Not aware of any actions arising again, other than probably to carry over to the session with the department. I'm going to suggest a short comfort break, and then we'll move on to our next evidence session. Okay. If we could just turn off the live feed there.
Committee Room 29. Sound. Committee Room 29. Sound. Committee Room 29. Sound. Committee Room 29. Sound. Committee Room 29, 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 Sound.
Okay, members, that takes us on to item 8 on the agenda, which is an oral briefing from the Department of Education officials on integrated education. And it is to help inform the committee's understanding of issues around integrated education, including decision-making, processes around parental choice, reasonable numbers, transformation, and I imagine a range of other issues. So we'll let the officials get seated, but with us today we have James Hutchinson, who is the Director of Climate Change and Collaboration within the department, and we have Adrian Murphy, who is the Integrated Education Act lead within the Department of Education. So you're both very welcome here today. So we've had 2 evidence sessions already around issues related to integrated education, so I imagine there will be some matters arising from that will be raised. But really at this stage I'll be handing over to yourselves for any opening remarks or presentation that you wish to make. We'd ask for that to be up to 10 minutes, and then we'll move into question and answer, and we tend to try and keep that to around 5 minutes per member, just to bear that in mind with your answers. But over to yourselves, and you're very welcome.
Chair, I'll make a very short statement, then we can move on to questions. So today I'm here to provide an update on the very complex task of implementing the Integrated Education Act itself, and Adrian is a lead on that particular piece of work. So firstly, I suppose the Act then defines integrated education, it redefines it. So it moves beyond talking about co-locating children from different backgrounds, and there's now a broadening of the definition to include a wider focus than just that between Catholic and Protestants. So the key change really now defines it as educating together those of different cultures and religious beliefs and of none. And while the Act still acknowledges the importance of reasonable numbers with Protestants and Roman Catholic children and young persons, so you know that in the terms of the wording of the Act itself. And this really reflects the increasing diversity of Northern Ireland's population, recognising that integration extends beyond the traditional Catholic-Protestant divide. I know some of your earlier speakers had raised that issue as well as saw some of their evidence. So as I said, the definition now includes the 2 other factors, socioeconomic and academic diversity. So it's those who are experiencing socioeconomic deprivation, those who are not, and those with different abilities. So again, that's just in terms of the Act itself. And the Act then further in Section 2 says integrated schools should intentionally support, protect and advance the ethos of diversity, respect and understanding across all these dimensions. So again, this is just the context we're working in. So that's a shift from a primarily religious focused understanding to a more comprehensive and inclusive one. And what we're doing in the department at the moment is not just the strategy, we're also looking at other pieces of work that need to be updated to reflect the new legislation. So one of those is the guidance on transformation itself, and that is something we're currently working on. And we hope to share a revised version of Integration Works with our Section 3 consultees in the coming weeks. That will reflect the new arrangements in the Act as well. So one of the key aspects of the Act is demand, and demand for integrated education. The Act itself acknowledges the increasing desire for integrated education, but translating desire into measurable demand is quite a complex undertaking. We need to move beyond anecdotal evidence towards something that we can say is a mechanism for data collection and analysis. So we've done a lot of work on that in the last few weeks and months rather. So how do we measure demand accurately? Are we talking about just parental applications to schools, or are we looking to understand latent demand? in communities, geographic areas and so on. So is it just in one area or is it more dispersed? Understanding those patterns is actually crucial for planning and resource allocation. So, and also to foster effective school planning, we must address the challenge of forecasting future demand. Demographic changes, parental attitude shifts, evolving community dynamics, they can all influence the demand for education, including integrated education. And so we're looking to see other predictive models we can develop and use that will assist in terms of anticipating future trends and so on. And so to identify the obligation to identify, assess, monitor and to meet demand, we have developed, in consultation with the Section 3 bodies and wider education stakeholders, a short online survey to be issued annually to parents of children going through the school admissions process. That's roughly 70,000 pupils per year go through that process. We, through EA colleagues, can access that group of parents and do a very targeted survey of those parents and ask them essentially a number of questions around why they chose a particular type of education. What were the factors in that decision? For example, was the issue of the school's criteria part of the decision making? And there's a number that we've done, and we're ready to issue that April this year.
Hopefully before the 9th of April.
Before the 9th of April. And we've also, and I know that colleagues from the Integrated Education Fund will refer to the concept of the societal level demand for integrated education. We're using the Northern Ireland Life and Time survey to ask a series of targeted questions over time. So we'll build up a pattern of answers over a period of years for longitudinal data towards attitudes in integrated education. And so we're doing that as well. We hope to have the reports from that in May and June of this year, and that will go a long way to providing information on demand level at the parental choice and at the societal level. And that really would give us, we think, quite a strong set of information. So one element of that survey as well is around the question of enrolment to schools and whether admissions criteria have an impact in terms of the choices parents make, and that will form part of future research we'll do on that very point. So we anticipate to have that by June and in ILT by May, and then we'll have a fairly comprehensive picture of demand, and we'll publish that in due course. So effectively, where we are at the moment is we have better data coming in, and that means that we'll be able to use that in terms of how we go forward. So while the new Act places a duty on us around the encouragement, facilitation, support, it doesn't alter the existing legislation structures and the process of making changes to the school network. So those remain the same. So members will be aware that schools can transform at the moment through a parental ballot. That involves consultation, planning and approval by us. Parental ballots are initiated either by the Board of Governors or indeed by a petition of a certain number of parents. None of that process has changed on the back of the Act, as you're aware. So likewise, the process for a development proposal, when a new school is needed or existing schools need to expand, that hasn't changed either. Those are still in place. So we have in that context been working to draft an updated strategy to meet the obligation to review where necessary. Just in terms of the history of this, the Act required us to produce a first strategy, which we did by the date required. That strategy required us then to produce what's called a Section 10 report and lay it before the Assembly. That was done in April of 2024. And so that was meeting, as it were, the first requirements of the Act. It also required us then to modify and review the strategy, and we did. We're currently in the process of drafting and almost finalising a reviewed integrated strategy, and we hope to have that available in the coming weeks for publication, and that will be publicly consulted upon. And so we have worked quite closely with the sector and indeed stakeholders more generally, including NICE, IEF and CSSC, in terms of developing not only the strategy but also the action plan and the targets associated with that. And we're working as well now at the moment to develop that more fully in terms of what the data sets and the enablers are behind that, so we can have a good picture of what information we need to gather to know we're being successful in delivering the strategy. So that, I apologise for the speed, but that's been a whistle-stop tour through the process to date, and we are happy to take any questions or queries you might have.
That's great. Thank you very much. I'll maybe pick up on the issues around demand, just as I'd asked some questions around that with our previous witnesses. And I think, to be fair to them, they were very polite, but I would say it would be fair to say there was a degree of frustration, I think, came through just around the pace at which things were moving in terms of that monitoring and aiming to meet demand process. I can see that there's a number of sort of different parts to this that you're working on. So with that in mind, I mean, how far away would you say the department is from having a sort of finalised version that you can articulate of this is how we will monitor demand and this is then how we will move to aim to meet that demand? So really, how far away are we from that sort of point?
I think the first point is this will be the first time with the surveys we're talking about we've had actual concrete data that we can rely upon. So we'll have information from the last cohort of parents who have chosen their school for their children. That includes all three choices, by the way, nursery, primary and post-primary. And then we also will have a societal level demand question, which we'll have, as I said, that will run year after year. So we'll build up a pattern of trends of how those questions are answered. So you'll get to see how the societal shift might or might not happen over time. And then the actual process itself, maybe you can describe how we're actually going through the setup.
I mean, the survey will go out to all of those 70,000 parents, including myself and others probably around the table here, to ask what are the have you made a choice? Did you choose integrated education? If not, why not? If you chose another school, if not, why? What were the factors that were underlying that? It'll also ask about did admissions criteria impact on your choices as a parent in terms of making that, and it will ask the question of if your school had been an option to transform, would you have wanted to transform? And that's very much in line with the same questions that we're asking at the Northern Ireland level. The Northern Ireland one will be a long series at a population level. These are much more, you will have data by phase of education and by postcode. So you would be able to pick, Cookstown and say there is a population of people in Cookstown that want integrated education, or saying that they prefer that, or it's simply going to have that data. It is not going to have the answer, and that's what I think what we want to make in terms of an important point. It's not going to say you need a new integrated school there. It's simply saying there is a population who are interested, and that's where we then want to work with NICE to say, in that locality, go and engage with the community and engage with the schools. And it's not just NICE, it could well be CSSC and all the other sectoral bodies to say, go and investigate that more fully. We can then have the capacity to say, we can survey that small locality by postcode to say, you've indicated this. If this proposal came up, what would you think?
And how often would you say that process would need to run? I mean, that's a fairly big piece of work to deliver that sort of a survey.
We'll run that process every year.
It'll be an annual process.
It will.
Do it annually.
And again, we need to run it every year for the, in its initial phase, it will, people, you've 70,000 parents where there's 70,000 people apply. You might get limited pockets where people haven't filled in, etc. So the longer it runs and the more data we have, the more accurate it will be.
Will that be published? Will the data be published?
Yeah, putting the two together with the Northern Ireland Life and Tire survey and the locality data, and the idea is that that's published and that becomes the planning basis for our area planning. It'll be useful for not just integrated education but all sectors.
Just one other quick point on that. One of the things that came out in the evidence session was maybe a slight concern that in areas where there simply is no integrated provision, will the survey give people the opportunity to reflect that back, that I simply didn't have the option to choose an integrated school?
I'd need to check on what we have in our draft, but I'm fairly sure we have a response which says there was no integrated provision in my area, so therefore you couldn't choose. So we will know in those localities, and it would be the same if they, if they wanted a more academic, they'd have put that, but if they wanted integrated, they'd put something else.
Okay,
So yes,
that's helpful. There's obviously one of the things that emerged again from the evidence session was that tension around sort of the Section 10 report that you referenced there from April 24, which highlighted post-primary, there being demand that was unmet for post-primary integrated education in the Ards and North Down area. Suggestion that there needed to be a formal call for transformation there because of the level of unmet demand. But then we had a school from that very area who was already in the system applying and had that that application refused in the development proposal. Do you accept that there is now a tension in terms of schools understanding how this process will work, and if they were to, if you do all this work to monitor demand, you put a call for transformation out, that there's maybe an issue around confidence that actually that process is now going to be honoured?
I think the point that we're coming to in the strategy, and it's something that we're working on at the moment, is around the information set to schools around the transformation process. The integration works guidance is currently in place. It's been there since 2017. part of the work we're doing, and I'd like to be able to say more, but it's still being developed, is to put not change the process, but certainly make it a much more transparent process so that everyone understands exactly what the steps are and how they go about the process of transformation. I think that will be important going forward. Every school in the transformation process has an awful lot to do. It's a long process. We've certainly known there's research published by AEF around the complexities of the process. What we're trying to do at the moment is work through that, and we hope to have something published something sent to the statutory consultees in the coming weeks, setting out how we'll go about it. I've been working with NICE on that recently. So we're trying to make the process much more understandable for schools and parents, so everything becomes available to them at the start. So the process is understood, the role of the school, the parent, the community, and so on, the governor, is all more easily understood by everyone. So that's probably what I would say in terms of response to that particular question.
I mean, just as an observation, I probably don't expect you to respond to it, but looking in at that scenario that we had, it sort of feels like the department and minister working across purposes, and I think there's certainly a perception out of there, but appreciate that there are issues related to legal challenge that perhaps you won't be able to speak to in any more detail. Look, I just wanted to ask a question with a bit more of a local angle, and then I'll open up to other members. It's really around Mid-Down Integrated College, so that is there's an approved development proposal for that. When's that school going to be delivered?
Well, at the moment, obviously the proposers have to go through a series of steps, and we're talking to NICE at the moment about what they're actually doing. At the moment, there are a number of steps they have to do. In terms of the date, I'm not sure what that date will actually be. We are engaging with NICE in terms of what support the school needs, and we'll take that forward.
How much resource has been allocated to delivering that project in the department?
At this stage, we are, that's the department, all we've done to date, as my understanding is we've assisted with some work around the site search. That is the work to do at this stage. First of all, there's some work to do by the proposers, then we'll work with NICE and see what further assistance can be provided.
Has the site been agreed upon?
Not as far as I'm aware, no.
Okay. And in terms of even any steps to take that forward, has a project board been appointed to take that work forward? It's obviously it's a fairly substantial piece of work, but to emphasise the development proposal is approved. There's an expectation in the local community, certainly in the school in Blackwater, which is inextricably linked to how that proposal works out. There's definitely a frustration, I think, in the local community that it feels like there's been an announcement and really then just silence from there. So. Are there steps being taken to move it forward? I would suggest
we're engaging with NICE. The initial steps need to be taken by the proposers, and then they have steps to take. I know NICE are engaging with them, and we will engage with NICE as part of that process as well. So at this stage, it is quite early, and it is probably at this stage it's hard to say just where they are, but we'll certainly keep engaging with NICE on that.
I think it's also to do with the technicalities of the fact that it is a grant-maintained integrated school as opposed to controlled integrated. So with the controlled integrated, the Education Authority will have the obligation there. The grant-maintained, it is the company and the Board of Governors who are the legal owners and lead of that project, supported by the department.
The funding to build that school will come from the department. So I mean, I think hearing there's no resource allocated to this that is concerning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the issue of funding is something that doesn't sit with us particularly, but we can certainly take that away and come back to you on that.
That's fine. Look, thank you for that. I'll pass over to the Deputy Chair.
Thanks, Chair. And just first of all, James, nothing to do with integrated education. I'm a bit curious about your job title, Director of Climate Change and Collaboration.
Yes.
You're here talking to us about integrated education.
Yeah, that is a source of unending mirth in the department. Collaboration really comes from the fact that we're looking at shared education, integrated education and Irish medium education. That is my education portfolio. I also look after the COVID inquiry response and the response to the NI Climate Act. So I'm here with my shared Irish and integrated hat on, particularly on integrated. So yes, that's.
And so the follow-on was that you were at the event organised by Corleone Gael Scully at the. So you've responsibility for Irish medium as well.
I think we'll see you in May on that particular subject as well. Pat, something scheduled.
Somebody in the department doesn't like you. So anyway, following on from some of the chair's questioning, in terms of the process to transform. A school sits down and decides we want to follow a process towards transformation. I presume it's a fairly lengthy process. The boards of governors have to agree with it. Then they have to consult with parents and whoever else. I don't know exactly what the process is, but I'm sure it's a fairly onerous task just to get a proposal to put on the minister's desk. Would that be right?
I think I would certainly there is a process to go through, and it does start with either the Board of Governors or the parent group having the decision taken that they want to proceed, and then there's the ballot, there's the development of the case for change, the DP process. There is a number, I suppose, of steps to be taken. Yes.
Yeah, and they could follow that process, put a proposal on the minister's desk, and the minister turns it down, and that may be because they weren't aware of what criteria the minister was going to give extra weight to in terms of all the sort of indicators where a school would want to transform. Would it not be a good idea then to be absolutely transparent about what sort of criteria a school needs to meet before it can transform to integrated status?
I think that very point, Pat, is the reason we're looking in detail at the integration works guidance at the moment. The point is that, and this is something I think I said earlier, I was at an event last year where IEF had some research done by Queen's on schools that had transformed, and the feedback was it was a complicated process and it was, to their mind, quite onerous. We took that away and are looking at that very point of how do we ensure that schools understand the exact steps they need to take to go through, and that's what we hope the revisions to that piece of work will come up with, and we want to be hopefully in the next few weeks to be able to consult with our Section 3 consultees on that.
And I suppose without going into any sort of detail on it, I suppose the proposed litigation will affect the outcome of that process as well.
We'll have to be very careful, yes, what we do, just to have mind of the litigation.
Anyways, moving on, there are a number of schools that have development proposals in the system. Have you any idea what the timelines are going to be for their decisions on those proposals?
I'm not aware of the exact timelines. I know there are a number in the system. Do you have any information, Aidan? I know
I think there are 4 in the
Yes.
system. To be honest, we don't have a timeline for those. Those are led by another part of the department, and there's rightly a bit of a Chinese wall in terms of that decision-making element of an evaluation between the department and us as officials. They provide that advice to Minister around those, but I'll just see if I can get the details of them here. Yeah, we've got Dunedin Primary School, Ballyhenry, Culmore and Downshire, some of which have been going from September last year, and the most recent one is in January. I worked in that area planning side for a while, and it can take 12 to 18 months to go through that process, consultation, gathering the data and making the case and checking all the information, and then it's still subject to ministerial decision.
So what's your best guess on a timeline then, Adrian?
I wouldn't want to guess. It's not within my remit to guess, but consistently those have taken between 6 months and 12 months to approve.
So that the average timeline then would be between 6 months to a year, maybe slightly longer, depending.
And some longer, some shorter.
Okay. Fair enough. Thanks for that.
Thank you, Deputy Chair David. You'd indicated.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thanks for your presentation so far. We had an interesting discussion in the last session there, which delved into some of the other diversity and so on we see within schools now, and how that relates to what has always been the integrated sort of ethos of trying to bring the two traditional communities together. And I guess it's in that context I wanted to ask around the current makeup of integrated schools, and what would be, as far as you're aware, the lowest number from each minority community in terms of existing integrated schools. So what would be the lowest number of Protestants at an integrated school, and then what would be the lowest number of Catholics at an integrated school?
Yeah, we can certainly provide information. Now, generally speaking, when a school transforms, it tends to have a relatively low number of the minority community, with the ambition to grow that number over time. So at any point in time, any school, depending on how far it is along in its transformation process, may have varying numbers. And some, I know there are some schools with relatively small numbers, but over time those numbers have shifted. We can certainly provide more information to you on that in terms of what we know in terms of data. Yeah.
Be interested to have that. Would you be aware at this stage of how many schools would currently have, say, less than 10% from a minority tradition?
I'm not aware of the exact number, but it's something we can certainly provide to you.
Yeah, I think that'd be worthwhile. Thank you very much. You talked about a starting point, and we had that discussion earlier as well. And one of the points made was that that is a starting point, and there's hope to build on that. some might look at some of the current proposals and so on and think that chances of growing from where a low starting point significantly in an area that doesn't have a huge populace of the minority community and already has schools serving that are quite integrated in and of themselves might be a challenge. Has it always followed that there's a rise after year one in terms of the percentage?
Without having data, I certainly would be loath to say yes, but generally speaking, I certainly can think of a number of cases where a relatively low number of the minority community has grown over a period of time, but I'd have to say it would need the actual data rather than just my own surmising on that.
And obviously at a previous committee session, one of your colleagues had said that zero or anything over zero would be deemed appropriate for a school to consider transforming to an integrated school. Would you share that view? And if you do you see how some in the general populace might see that as farcical?
I think the point about a minimum number or a threshold number, you'll be aware that, for example, there's various guidance. I don't know, NICE, for example, would have said 40, 40, 20. Mm-hmm. There was guidance up until a number of years ago that said a minimum of 10. It's very difficult to say there isn't a fixed number, because a lot of other factors come into it. For example, the question of not just Protestant versus Catholic, but then other, and indeed people from newcomer communities and so on. So there's quite a lot more to it than just numbers of such. But I think the point is that every school will be different. Each school community is different. Each area they draw from is different. So it's quite hard for us to say the number shall be X and that'll be it set in stone. So I mean, one of the things that we certainly would expect a debate on the back of the strategy is that very question. I mean, what is a reasonable number? Can it be defined as a figure, or should it be something else more fluid? That's again something that needs to be drawn forward, I think.
I think it's also just important to put that in context, because the reasonable number clause within the definition is the second part of that clause. It is actually saying, those of different cultures, religious beliefs, and of none, including. So that is the primary clause, and the second bit of that clause is including reasonable numbers. With this is, we mentioned it's subject to some legal issues around that, and will no doubt be, because the interpretation of that clause is very complex. Mm-hmm. Because you can have a very broad interpretation or a very narrow interpretation, and they're both quite within interpretation of the law.
And he said in the last session, our reason around raising this is not in any way to denigrate the good work being done by integrated schools, but it's actually the contrast between those in other sectors who sometimes feel that the integrated name is being used to imply a degree of virtue that they are then implied not to have in that sense. So in that way, you talked about the integrated ethos, mm-hmm. and that is that integrated schools intentionally support, protect, mm-hmm. and advance an ethos of diversity, respect and understanding between those of different cultures and religious beliefs and of none, between those of different socio-economic backgrounds and between those of different abilities. Could I ask you which other sector in Northern Ireland do you believe doesn't fulfil all of those things?
Again, this is, I think, the point we've made many times before. The education system is meant to do all of that already. I think the integrated sector makes a specific point around the breaking down of barriers between traditionally the Protestant and the Catholic communities. I think that is the ethos that it grew from. And I think the sector would still, I'm not speaking for the sector, but they would still maintain that is their selling point, their USP, if you like, of what they do.
Well, to clarify, you don't think that there is any other sector that doesn't necessarily deliberately try to do all those things?
There are differences between the sectors in terms of how successful they are in terms of addressing socio-economic needs, but those are by the nature of the sector.
Those things can be achieved within the other sectors?
Absolutely.
We're not saying they can, absolutely.
No, thank you. Thanks, Chair. And thanks for your answers.
Just maybe to make a point, or maybe to ask another question. I mean, David framed it there as, is it farcical to suggest that a school with a very, very low, you'd suggest that the 0% or a very low number of a minority community applying to transform, if that is farcical, is there not another way to look at it, that by virtue of those very low numbers that makes the case as to why transformation would be desirable, because the school wants to do better and proactively wants to improve those numbers? Is that something you see coming through in transformation proposals?
Without being specific, a number of transformation proposals in their case for change would set out how that school would go about attracting members of what they deem to be their minority community. And that is, I've seen it in many proposals. So
Seems to be entirely reasonable if you acknowledge that you are underrepresented in one particular community that you may wish to
just clarify that, Chair,
take transformation forward.
It was how people may perceive that to be. I think, in this particular context, I think it's whenever there's other schools in different sectors in that area that arguably are much more successfully integrated in that sense. So that's the context in which I was asking that. But take your point.
I think the phrase farcical was perhaps overstating things a little, but that's grand. Michelle, you were next.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks for your time today. There's a lot of ground already been covered, I think, over the two sessions and even within this discussion, so I'll try not to overlap. But I think the first question is really, apart from the job title, one which Pat stole on me, has the Minister's decision in terms of the Bangor decisions set a precedent that's influencing how you're taking forward work on the strategy or work on the transformation guidance?
I think it will be very difficult to answer that question given there's a legal challenge involved, but the strategy has been developed over a long period with the sector. We've started working this, the leader and I took this on as a job a number of 18-20 months ago. The process has been very inclusive, and we've worked with everyone, not just integrated sector, and we've worked it up in a way that we are content that we have now put a draft that is consistent with the requirements of the Act. And it's an issue that we think when it does get to the stage of publication, you can certainly look at, and we're happy to come back when it is published and be interrogated in more detail on the strategy content. So I think that's probably the best way to answer that one.
Yeah, I suppose we'll see the strategy when it comes forward, but just based on what you've said, I'm getting the impression then, or maybe not, that the definition of integrated education and the need to maybe broaden that, is that something that will be brought out in the strategy? We've talked today in other sessions, have talked about SEN, they've talked about socioeconomic. Is that something that we'll get to discuss? Or?
The strategy has to deliver in that the department must meet the requirements of the legislation. So the legislation has driven the strategy, and the legislation has defined integrated education in a certain way, therefore the strategy must follow that. So I suppose that's the explanation as to how things have been developed.
Okay. I don't know if you can answer this one, but around area...
Sorry, Michelle Clark was just looking to come in there.
I just wanted to say there is an active judicial review about the strategy, so the officials will go, they're very conscious of it, but I just want to make sure that everybody else knows.
Okay, thank you. Area planning, I don't know if you're aware of any plans to kind of undertake any kind of review of area planning in light of the independent review of education that might then alter how we take forward integrated education as we've described. At the minute, it's very much a grassroots kind of approach up rather than the department looking at that more holistically.
I don't believe that there's anything in the current plans to work on the area planning recommendations from the review at this stage, but colleagues maybe answer that in more detail. And I think
the point we've made is the legislation that sets out that development proposal process, etc., hasn't changed, and that is quite onerous. And having gone through some of that in a previous role, it's time consuming and onerous because it's been subject to legal challenge, quite considerable legal challenge, and therefore you wouldn't forgive us as civil servants wanting to make sure we've crossed every T and dotted every I to make sure that any advice we put to a minister is robust and a deliverable. And that's some of the issues that we have around here. Around the data is exactly the same. We must have something. There's no point in us getting data for something if at some point another sector or body can challenge that.
Yeah. I suppose the last one, again, you may not be able to answer it, but it's around the jointly managed schools, again, that kind of community school concept from the independent review of education. Obviously there's appears to be a real synergy between what that aspires to do and what integrated education is already doing. Is that again something that you're looking at or taking forward in this context?
It's not something we're looking at specifically in the strategy because this is around the Act, but the concept of a jointly managed school is something that was referred to in the independent review, and there's nothing, I think we have the concept in our own legislation of
the legislation is permissive, yeah. And to that extent I think there was a development proposal for a joint faith school some time ago. It's turned down, it was unsustainable, but the legislation is there, and if a community wanted to go through it in that process rather than go through a GMI school, the department will look at that proposal and make its decision on that in the same way it would do with any other development proposal.
Just to pick up very quickly, so from the independent review, the idea of an independent area planning commission is not currently being taken forward then in terms of looking at our school estate and sustainability issues and
my
isolated
understanding
pairs
is
in rural
it's
communities? and all
not
those
in the
issues?
phase that we've talked about recently. Again, I'm not sure what the position is in longer term, but certainly it wasn't in the paper that was published recently on that, or the Minister's comments on that.
Fine. Peter, you were indicating.
Good, thank you very much. Chair, I just have one question, gentlemen, and it's on the Integrated Education Act, and I asked a sort of similar question earlier on today. I'll just read it out for you. Integrated education means the education together in an integrated school of those of different cultures and religious beliefs and of none, including reasonable numbers of both Protestant and Catholic children or young persons. And it's with regard to the thing that we've been talking about in terms of the recent decision to turn down the DP. In terms, and it's a drafting question, which I know that you both know quite a bit about, but in terms of how that's drafted and what the Minister said at committee around there not being reasonable numbers at, in particular, Bangor Academy, and a figure of sort of 3 or 2.7% was cited. If that was and the argument against that is that actually, and we heard this from NICE and IEF, that it's an aspirational number, you know, they grow, and James, you referenced a little bit of that in your previous answer. Should that legislation not have been drafted, those are different cultures and religious beliefs and none, including an aspiration of reasonable numbers, or including reasonable numbers within a reasonable time frame, or including an aim to achieve reasonable numbers in the future? So there's nothing in that clause that says it's aspirational in terms of what numbers of a minority community it needs to get to. So is it not reasonable then to say that, and the DP who came to the committee said that a school could transform if it had 0% of a minority community. Is that not, it doesn't make sense to me that those two things can run in tandem. I wonder if you want to sort of comment on that, particularly within that clause, that there is no aspirational or timescale or we will do this in the future aspect of the clause. It's just definitive in what it says.
I think that's just the drafting of the bill itself. Again, when you're drafting legislation, sometimes the wording can have unfortunate ambiguities thereafter. I think the point is that the drafting is as it is, and the strategy will have to reflect the drafting. But I think there's a point to say that, look, I think the point of a school which has an aspiration to achieve a reasonable number over time, I don't think that we're saying that you must have it, straight away. We're saying that you can have a plan that says if your case for change clearly says that over the next number of whatever number of school years, we will work to do X, Y, and Z to increase our intake in each year that comes in. Certainly, I think you can still, that would certainly cover the aspirational aspect. I think you're right that the wording could have been clearer, possibly, and I can see where you would say that. But again, there are other ways for a school to become or to demonstrate an aspiration to achieve higher numbers.
But in terms, James, of a legal defence, and I've seen this argument quite a bit on the internet recently, that actually the Minister, in terms of that legislation and that clause 1.1a, which I read out to you, he was basically saying, actually, there isn't, at this point in time, there isn't reasonable numbers at the school, and further, the capacity for growth, given the fact that there's a very successful CCMS school in the area, which most parents are sending their kids to, that actually there isn't necessarily a room to grow, and actually further than that, the school couldn't show that it has reasonable numbers of a minority community there already.
I think that will be possibly straying into JR territory, so I would rather not answer that specific around that case, because I know your point, but again, that would possibly be something that would be straying into the legal argument there.
Thanks, James. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you, Peter. Not seeing any indications online, so I think that has brought us our session to a close. So thank you both for your time this afternoon. And just while the witnesses are making their way out, we can have a think then around any actions arising from our sessions this afternoon. couple of ones just that I have noted down, and then happy for the clerk to highlight any others and for members to bring any others forward. I think just following on from the Deputy Chair's question, I think there was an interest in getting a full update on outstanding development proposals for transformation to integrated status, and just in terms of where those are at. So I think if we could seek that. And following on from my question around Mid-Down Integrated College, I know I would certainly be very keen to get details around intentions of setting up a project board and of when some budget will be allocated to this, because I think there's very clear expectation in the local community that that project is going to be delivered, and I didn't hear a lot in terms of tangible progress there. But happy for the clerk to give us anything else that we'd wanted clarity on, or any other members.
Yeah, I just have that the witnesses were going to come back to the committee about resourcing for new integrated schools, and also then that after any legal action about the strategy has finished, they'll come back and advise on that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Are there any other issues arisen, David?
There was the information that they were going to come back to in terms of the
demographic breakdown in schools that are transformed. Yeah. I think that's noted as well. Then. That's correct. Okay, not saying any others, so that's fine. So we'll move on to the next item on our agenda, which is item 9, and that's correspondence. So I'd refer members to pages 32 to 90 of your packs and pages 72 to 78 of tabled papers. And as usual, there's item 9.1 there provides at page 32 is a summary note of all the correspondence to come through. So I'll just go through any where there is a need for a committee decision to be taken. If there's anything I've missed that a member wants to highlight, do just let me know. So item 9.3 on page 52, it's a response from the NIO regarding the Interim Public Services Transformation Board. Now I think things have moved on since then, as we have had clear announcements around the funding that's been allocated from that. I think on the back of that, I think it would probably be timely then. I think on the back of that correspondence, I would suggest that we write to the Minister for clear details of how he plans to spend the allocation that he was given. I think it was 27 million was the amount awarded in terms of what specific transformation projects he's going to deliver out of that. And then also maybe for an update from the department around the status of any other projects that were bid for that haven't yet received any allocation, and if those bids are still live in the system for any of the unallocated monies. Is there anything else on that? I think we're very clear as a committee how important this money is, and it seems to be absolutely critical in terms of delivering on the SEND transformation agenda. So I think as much detail as we can get from the Minister, the better. And then obviously we have officials coming in a couple of weeks to discuss the SEND plans in more detail. But are we agreed on that? Item 9.6 on page 58, it's correspondence from the Cubby Sensory Hub with some testimonials from multiple schools. I really just wanted to check, this may have been at committee last week, has there been correspondence that has come through from the EA on that? Because I know we had asked about that. Is that still outstanding?
I think I did have a reply.
We did have a reply in on that. I think if that replies in, I would propose we note at this stage then. Are we agreed? Item 9.8 on page 66, it's a memo from the clerk to the Committee for Finance regarding budget sustainability plans. It seems very much that there is more to come on that, so I would just propose we note if members are agreed. Item 9.9, page 67, again a further memo from the clerk to the Committee for Finance regarding capital easements. It seems to relate potentially to a legal challenge, but they were quite clear it doesn't impact on any education projects, so again I would propose that we note. Are we agreed? And then item 9.13 on page 74 of tabled items, it's correspondence from the Committee for Health, forwarding a response from the Minister of Health regarding on-site medical supervision or nursing provision in special educational needs schools. So I think I'm grateful that the Health Committee have forwarded that on, as it was an item that received a lot of discussion at our session at Middletown. I would want to note a concern at this stage that the letter begins with setting out the sort of terms of reference of a review, but very much concludes by setting out what seems to me as a case for the effectiveness of the current system of classroom assistants delivering medical care, and it seems to me to maybe perhaps be the wrong way around, and I wouldn't have expected for the letter to finish on that if it is genuinely being approached with an open mind. So, I mean, I would want to propose that we do write to the Health Minister and make him aware we have sight of the letter and note that there is a concern that the review may not be being approached with an open mind, and that we would want to be clear that there's no prejudged outcome, that the current model is what they're going to land on. I would also like to get clarity on the scope of the review. So is the review actively considering reinstating nursing provision where it's been withdrawn, or are we just dealing with options around retention in schools that currently have it? And I would also really to reflect feedback that I've received from principals of special schools. They're not aware of any active engagement with their schools being undertaken currently. Now that may come, but I would really like to get clarity from the Health Minister. Is he going to engage with school leaders, teachers and classroom assistants in those schools who are being asked to carry out these tasks? Because I think that's absolutely vital. Some sort of desktop review is not going to cut it, in my view. Are we agreed on those actions? I think the committee has been quite clear. We are aware of the seriousness of this. Is there anything else we would want to communicate to the Health Minister at this stage? Because I think it's important the committee's views are communicated to the Minister while we have the opportunity with a review being underway.
Just stress the urgency.
Yeah, this is really urgent.
It's going on long enough. These schools are in limbo. It's not good.
Yeah, absolutely. Anything else? No, we're agreed. Okay, and then item 9.14. It's correspondence from Steve Aiken, MLA, is on a specific issue with a school in his area around the pausing of the school enhancement programme at Kilbride Central Primary School. I just thought it was worth flagging, as the issue did come up at question time when the Education Minister quite clearly and unequivocally distanced himself from the EA decision to pause funding for schools that were in the SEP programme at the moment. Now I know that there are a set of schools in the SEP programme that are very, very far away from getting money, but there are some that are at much near the top of the list. I would just note an interest in I am a governor on a school that is in the SEP programme, but it is one that is very far away from receiving money, so it's no direct impact on me in terms of this decision. But I think we should be writing to the Minister to get clarity on the status of the school enhancement programme. If it is indeed being paused, if it's being paused, is that to divert resource to special educational needs investment? Because our understanding that we heard very clearly from the department was that there was a separate capital budget for SEND, so that would maybe be something we weren't anticipating. Our members agreed that we do write and get that clarity, given that there seems to be a disagreement between Minister and EA on this. We agreed. Yeah. Okay. Other than that, are members content to dispose of the correspondence as per the summary note at page 32? Agreed.
Just on it was now passed, but the invite to the Transform Ed event yesterday. Could we see about getting physical copies? I know they had them yesterday, but by the time I went to try and get one, I think they were gone. So just in terms of,
we could ask if committee members could have a physical copy. Yeah.
Possible.
That's
got the last one, David.
I walked past the pile, and then when I went back, they were gone.
Mistake.
That's great. Okay, so that moves us on to item 10 then, which is the draft forward work programme, which is at page 92 of your pack. So I'll just ask the clerk to speak to that initially, and then we'll go from there.
So next week is the outdoor education event, which has, I suppose, largely been preparing in the background with the assistance of Forest Schools. So it would be great if all members could attend that. There will be lunch and some kind of wood related activity.
Intrigued.
I know. I don't want to spoil it. And then there will be some scene setting speakers, like speaking for a very short time, just about their perspectives from teachers from different schools, perspectives of academics on outdoor education, the autism reviewer, and a range of participants, and then we'll go to tables and have discussions about what an outdoor education in schools strategy might look like and what might be the components. There are some good practice kind of representatives from the Republic and also from Scotland who are going to describe what they have, and in particular Scotland have curriculum resources that look quite enviable for teachers to take any lesson outside. But there are obviously going to be participants who are from mental health charities and SEND support charities and organisations, because there are benefits for those pupils as well. So yeah, it would be great if everybody could attend in the Long Gallery, and it'll be 1 to 4:30. 30, that kind of time.
And can I
then the
check, will there
following
be
week-
departmental EA, CA
Yeah,
representation
sorry,
of that?
there
Because I think it
will-
would be good to have that.
and ATI,
Yeah,
all of
that's
them are
great.
going to have some representation.
Brilliant.
And we're hoping to get counterpart inspectors from Wales and Scotland, but that hasn't been confirmed just now. So if there's anybody else that you want to invite, please do let me know. If you want to invite colleagues from other committees, do let me know. I think Cheryl was the person who initially came up with the theme of outdoor education, so you might want her to come along. And then, so there will be a pack of papers, and a lot of it will be just about academic work or projects that have happened about outdoor education, and then we'll boil it down to 2 or 3 topics for the questions. Okay, and then the following week we're going to be in Bangor Academy. From 1, Mark, isn't that what we're... Yeah, so there'll be a lunch and a visit of the SPIM provision, and then the committee meeting will go on as usual from 2 with SEN, with Caleb's cause and a SEN update from departments, and also some update information on pension regs and I don't know if they can speak about negotiations, but that it's the same team. So that'll be before the end of the financial year, which is, I think, useful given the committee's concerns last week. And the only other thing about Forward Work Plan is just we have Corleona Gael Scully Octa in on the 7th. We were supposed to have the team in the department just after that, and the lead official isn't available to come that same day. So I mean, if you're happy, I can see if I can move both sessions to another day so that we can have that thematic approach.
My preference would always be that if you have a stakeholder in that, if you can have the department or the EA that can speak to that, to their evidence, it's more helpful if that works. But if other members are agreed, great.
And then we'll be programming in our bill timeline next. So,
But I think in terms of we would anticipate that would be June, a number of evidence sessions in June, really on the back of the call for evidence on the school uniforms bill. So. Okay, well that's great. Thank you for that. Are our members content to endorse the Forward Work Programme as drafted? Agreed. Okay, so that takes us to item 11, which is any other business. Is there any other business? No. So then item 12, date, time and place of next meeting. So that will be, as just discussed, in the Long Gallery, which will be an outdoor education event starting with lunch at 1 p.m. The next formal committee meeting is scheduled for Wednesday the 26th of March, 2 p.m, and that will be at Bangor Academy and Sixth Form College. And again, for members, that will be preceded with a visit at 1 p.m. to have a look at their SEN provision in that school. So that just leaves me to put the question that the committee meeting does now adjourn. Are we agreed?
Agreed.
Okay.
Committee Room 29. Sound. 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 Committee Room 29. Sound.